A woman who had nothing, a child standing between life and death, and one split-second decision that neither of them could take back. Claire Dawson was 30 years old and already exhausted by life. Not the dramatic kind of exhaustion people talk about, but the quiet, grinding kind that nobody sees. She wasn't looking for a miracle that afternoon. She was just trying to get through another shift without crying in the break room. Then she heard the screaming, and every bill, every sleepless night, every year of invisible sacrifice stopped mattering. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The rain had been coming down since noon, and by 3:30 it wasn't falling so much as it was attacking. Claire Dawson stood at the mouth of the West Side Food Mart's rear service exit and stared out at the parking lot like a general surveying a battlefield she had no interest in fighting on. The pavement had stopped being pavement about an hour ago. Now it was something closer to a shallow river, gray water pushing in slow, dirty currents between the painted yellow lines, carrying cigarette butts and crushed coffee cups, and whatever else people dropped and forgot about. The shopping cart she was supposed to retrieve had drifted toward the far end of the lot, bunched together near the drainage grate like they were trying to escape. She pulled her orange vest tighter, even though it didn't help. The thing was thin as paper and had a broken zipper. She'd reported it to Marcus, her shift supervisor, 3 separate times. He kept writing it down in the little notebook he carried, which she had come to understand meant the same thing as throwing the request directly in the trash. Dawson! Marcus appeared behind her holding a clipboard and not getting wet. Those carts aren't going to walk themselves back in. I know. Customers need carts. I know, Marcus. He lingered for a second like he wanted to say something that would motivate her, then apparently decided against it and walked back toward the registers. Claire breathed out slowly through her nose and stepped into the rain. The cold hit her face like an open hand. She tucked her chin down and moved fast, navigating the flooded lot with the particular efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Her sneakers soaked through in the first 10 seconds. She stopped noticing after the first 30. There was a system to cart retrieval. Work from farthest to closest, chain them together as you go, keep your head down and don't make eye contact with drivers who look annoyed that you exist in their way. It wasn't complicated work, but it demanded a specific kind of mental surrender. You had to stop caring about being cold and wet and invisible. You had to just become the task. Claire had gotten very good at that particular skill over the past 6 years. She grabbed the first cluster of carts near the far fence and started linking them. The rain hammered the metal roofs of the cars around her. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine idled with a low, bored rumble. She thought about her apartment, specifically about the radiator, which had been making a new sound since Tuesday. A ticking, rhythmic clicking that she hadn't had time to figure out yet. Her landlord, Mr. Potansky, would say it was fine. He always said everything was fine. The man could watch the ceiling collapse and describe it as settling. She was halfway through building her cart chain when she heard it. At first she thought it was a cat. The sound was high and thin and desperate, carrying through the rain in short, broken bursts. She straightened up and looked around. The parking lot was busy for a Wednesday afternoon. Cars pulling in and out of spaces, headlights cutting pale arcs through the gray curtain of rain, windshield wipers going. Nothing looked wrong. She went back to the carts. Then she heard it again. Not a cat, a child. She moved toward the sound before she made a conscious decision to do it. That was the honest truth of it. Her body started moving and her brain caught up a second later, going, "Wait, what are we doing?" Her sneakers slapped through the standing water as she jogged toward the main traffic lane that cut through the center of the lot. She rounded the end of a parked minivan and stopped dead. In the middle of the driving lane, between a silver Honda pulling slowly forward and a red pickup that hadn't noticed yet, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 3, maybe younger. She was wearing a yellow raincoat with a hood that had blown back off her head, and her dark hair was plastered flat against her face by the rain. She was crying the way very small children cry when they're beyond scared, not loud, theatrical sobbing, but this thin, helpless wailing that came from somewhere deep and animal and terrified. In her arms she clutched a stuffed rabbit. White, or it had been white once. Now it was soaked gray. The red pickup hadn't stopped. Claire ran. She didn't think about the Honda. She didn't think about the pickup. She didn't think about her wet sneakers slipping on the pavement, or the fact that she was running directly into active traffic, or the very real possibility that neither driver would see her in time. She just ran, and the whole world narrowed down to that small figure in the yellow coat and the stuffed rabbit and the sound of a truck engine that was still moving. She reached the girl and scooped her up in one motion, tucking her against her chest and pivoting hard to her right, getting them both behind the Honda's bumper as the red pickup rolled past. Close enough that Claire felt the wind displacement against her back, close enough that she heard the driver finally hit the brakes with a screech and a muttered curse through the cracked window. Claire stood between two parked cars, holding the child pressed against her chest, and for a moment she couldn't hear anything except the rain and her own heartbeat absolutely losing its mind. The little girl was gripping Claire's vest with both fists, Rabbit squashed between them, still crying but quieter now. The kind of quiet that comes when a child doesn't fully understand what almost happened, but understands perfectly that someone is holding them. "Hey," Claire managed. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "Hey, you're okay. I got you. You're okay." She pulled back enough to look at the girl's face, big dark eyes swimming with tears, a small nose running freely, a chin that was trembling so hard it was almost vibrating. "What's your name?" Claire asked. The girl just stared at her. "Okay, that's okay." Claire shifted her weight, looking around the parking lot. "Where's your mom? Your dad? Who brought you here?" "Nothing." The girl blinked rain out of her eyes and tightened her grip on the rabbit. "Okay, we're going to figure this out." Claire started moving toward the sidewalk, carrying the girl, scanning the lot. "Someone is looking for you. People don't just lose. Someone is definitely looking." She hadn't even finished the thought when she heard the shouting. "Sophie!" The voice came from the direction of the store entrance, raw and cracked with panic, and Claire turned to see a man in a dark coat running through the rain at a speed that did not look casual. He wasn't jogging, he was running. The flat-out, every muscle committed, I don't care what I look like kind of running that people only do when something genuinely terrible might be happening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and even at a distance, Claire could see that his face had gone completely white. "Sophie!" The word broke somewhere in the middle of it. The little girl in Claire's arms went rigid for half a second, then burst into fresh crying. "Daddy!" The man covered the remaining distance in what felt like 4 seconds, and then he was there, right in front of Claire, and she had just enough time to notice that he was probably early 30s, that his dark hair was getting wrecked by the rain, that his coat probably cost more than her monthly rent, before he reached past her and took the girl out of her arms. He folded Sophie against him like he was trying to absorb her, one hand pressing the back of her wet head into his shoulder, his eyes squeezing shut for a moment. The sound he made wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not crying. It was something in between, the sound of a person who got to the edge of something unbearable and pulled back just in time. Claire stood there, suddenly aware that she was dripping wet and that her hands were shaking slightly and that she didn't really know what to do with herself now. The man pulled back and looked at his daughter's face, checking her over with both hands, touching her cheeks, her arms, her head. "Are you hurt? Sophie, baby, are you hurt anywhere?" Sophie shook her head against his chest. "She's okay," Claire said. She had to speak up over the rain. She wasn't hit. She was in the driving lane, but she wasn't hit. The man looked up at Claire then, really looked at her. Not the dismissive half-second glance she was used to getting while wearing the orange vest. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand something important. "You got her out," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah." "You ran into traffic." She was in the lane and the pickup wasn't stopping. His jaw was working. He was trying to put something together and having trouble doing it. His eyes were dark brown and completely unguarded in a way that seemed out of character somehow. Like this was a man who didn't often look like this in front of people. "The red truck," he said slowly. "It stopped. Eventually." "Oh, God." He pressed his face against Sophie's hair for a moment. His shoulders rose and fell once, hard. "Oh, thank God." Sophie had stopped crying and was now watching Claire over her father's shoulder with enormous, attentive eyes, still clutching the rabbit. She was asking about the rabbit, Claire offered, because she needed to say something and that was the most neutral available thing. In the parking lot, I think she might have dropped it and gone back for it. The man lifted his head and looked at Claire again. "What?" The stuffed rabbit. I'm guessing she saw she dropped it and went back to get it, and that's how she ended up in the lane. Kids do things like that. She paused. I don't actually have kids. That's just a guess. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, more like a person trying to remember how to make one. I put her down for 2 seconds. I was getting the stroller out of the trunk and He stopped. 2 seconds. That's all it takes. Yeah. His voice was hollow. That's all it takes. They stood in the rain for another awkward beat. Claire was beginning to feel the cold properly now, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving behind just the wet and the chill and the fact that she still had 12 carts out in the lot and Marcus would be watching the clock. I should get back, she said, jerking her chin vaguely toward the store. I'm still on shift. Wait. The man adjusted Sophie against his hip and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a card. Thick, cream-colored, the kind of cardstock that has a certain weight to it. He held it out to her. Please, I need to thank you properly. My name is Alexander Hayes. Claire looked at the card but didn't take it immediately. Claire Dawson. Claire. He said her name carefully, like he was making sure he had it right. Please take the card. I want to find a way to show how much... He stopped again, apparently struggling with the fact that words were failing him in a situation where he really wanted them not to. Sophie chose that moment to reach out toward Claire with both arms, rabbit dangling by one ear from her small fist. The gesture was so sudden and so simple and so completely legible that it stopped everything for a second. Claire reached out and let the little girl grab her finger. Sophie's grip was serious, not playful, like she was making a point. Hi, Claire said softly. Sophie stared at her. You're okay now, Bug. Your dad's got you. Sophie didn't let go of her finger for another 5 seconds. Then she turned and buried her face in her father's neck. Claire took the card. Back inside, she dried off as best she could in the break room with paper towels, changed into the spare socks she kept in her locker. This wasn't the first time, not even the first time this month, and ate half a granola bar while standing up because there wasn't time to sit down. Marcus did not ask her if she was okay. He asked her where she'd been for 9 minutes, and she told him she'd been getting the carts, and he made a mark in his notebook, and that was that. She put the business card in her locker without looking at it again. She had 3 more hours on shift. The rain outside had settled into a steady, purposeful downpour, drumming against the skylights of the store in slow waves. Customers came in tracking wet footprints across the tile, grabbing their baskets, moving through the aisles with the particular single-minded focus people get in grocery stores. Like the presence of so much organized food creates a temporary force field against the rest of the world's problems. Claire ran the register for the last part of her shift. She smiled when she was supposed to and said, "Have a nice evening, and do you need your receipt? And did you find everything okay?" And she meant exactly none of it, which was a perfectly professional level of performance for a grocery store at the end of a 9-hour shift. But she kept thinking about the girl's eyes, that particular kind of stillness that had settled over Sophie once she was being held, the way the panic had drained out of her small face and been replaced with something exhausted and trusting. Claire had held a child who was terrified, and in the space of about 45 seconds, that child had decided she was safe. Not because Claire had done anything remarkable or said anything brilliant, just because she'd shown up and held on. It was a small thing. It was also the most honest exchange Claire had had with another human being in a while, which was a thought she didn't examine too carefully. She got home at 7:15. The apartment was what it was, 600 square feet in Wicker Park that smelled faintly of old radiator heat and the Thai place downstairs. 1 bedroom barely big enough for a full bed and a dresser. A kitchen that was technically functional if you didn't need more than 1 person in it at a time. A couch she'd had since college, which now had a permanent depression in the middle cushion in the exact shape of every tired evening she'd ever spent on it. She dropped her bag by the door and stood in the middle of the living room in her damp work clothes, and did not move for a full minute. This was a thing she did sometimes. Not meditating. She had no patience for that. Just standing still and letting the day settle around her like sediment, letting the noise quiet down so she could hear what was actually left. What was left tonight was exhaustion, the particular dull ache in her lower back that came from hours on concrete floors, and a faint but persistent thought about a 3-year-old in a yellow raincoat. She heated up the remaining half of a rotisserie chicken she'd bought 2 days ago and sat at her kitchen table, which was also her desk, her bill-paying station, and on bad nights, her crying location, and ate over the sink because she hadn't bothered to get a plate. Outside, the rain continued. The radiator clicked. Her phone showed 2 messages from her mother, Diane, who lived 40 minutes away in a care facility in Oak Park, where she'd been receiving treatment for early-onset Parkinson's for the past 3 years. The first message was from this afternoon. Occupational therapy was good today. Made a bird from construction paper. Don't laugh. The second was from an hour ago. Did you eat dinner? Something real, not just crackers. Claire looked at the stripped chicken carcass and the paper towel she was using as a napkin and typed back, "Yes, Mom, real food. Rest up. I'll call tomorrow." She washed the pan. She paid 2 bills online, avoided looking at a third, turned off the kitchen light. She sat on the couch with the business card from Alexander Hayes and looked at it properly for the first time. Alexander Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Global Holdings. She'd heard the name before, vaguely, the way you hear names that float through the background of the city, in headlines on the news playing in the break room, in overheard conversations at the registers when customers talk to each other about downtown developments or real estate. Hayes Global was in commercial real estate and tech investments and several other things that were large and complicated and completely unrelated to Claire's life. The man in the parking lot had looked, under all that money, like someone who was holding something very heavy and had been holding it alone for a long time. She put the card on the table. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. She almost threw the card away. That was the honest version of the story. She stood at her kitchen counter the next morning with coffee going in the machine and the card in her hand, and she thought, this is the kind of thing that doesn't go anywhere. Rich people feel grateful for about 48 hours, and then their actual life absorbs them again, and the grocery store worker becomes an anecdote. A story they tell at dinner parties about the time they almost lost their daughter in a parking lot in the rain. She put the card in the junk drawer instead. That was her version of not throwing it away. She was on afternoon shift today, which meant she had the morning, which meant she could take the train to Oak Park and sit with her mother for an hour before heading in. She did this whenever the schedule allowed it. It was the part of her week she was most protective of. Diane Dawson was 61 years old, small and sharp-eyed, and the Parkinsons had taken things from her in the specific cruel way the disease operates, stealing steadiness and ease and the small, effortless movements that healthy people take completely for granted while leaving her mind entirely intact to witness the whole process. She had a dark humor about it that Claire had learned to match. "You look tired," her mother said when Claire came in and settled into the chair by the window. "Good morning to you, too. That's my morning greeting. You look tired." Diane studied her. Something happened. It wasn't a question. Her mother had always done this, a kind of X-ray attention that Claire both relied on and found slightly unnerving. She hadn't told her about the parking lot yet. She did now, keeping it brief. The rain, the girl in the lane, the truck. Her mother was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, "Did you get a thank you?" "He gave me a card." "His card? A business card?" "Yes." "And you put it in the junk drawer?" Claire looked at her. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Diane smoothed the blanket over her lap with her right hand, the steadier one. "Claire, the man's daughter was nearly... I know what nearly happened." "Then you understand why he's not going to let it go with a card." She was right, as it turned out. Claire was in the break room at the store the next afternoon, 40 minutes into her shift, eating the second half of a granola bar she'd started that morning, when Marcus appeared in the doorway with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was something like discomfort, or possibly awe, or possibly the collision of both at once. "There's someone asking for you," he said. "I'm on break." "Claire, there's a man out there in a suit that probably costs more than this whole store asking for you by name." He leaned against the doorframe. "In the nicest way possible. I really think you should come out there." Alexander Hayes was standing near the customer service counter in a charcoal suit and a dark tie, holding a coffee cup from the place across the street, looking precisely the way a man looks when he is deeply accustomed to controlling every room he enters, but is currently making a deliberate effort not to do that. He'd gotten a haircut since yesterday, or maybe his hair just behaved differently when it wasn't being destroyed by rain. He looked less wrecked, more like whatever he usually looked like. Sophie was not with him. Several customers were looking at him. He didn't appear to notice. When he saw Claire come around the corner, his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but something like it, like he'd prepared for the possibility that she might not come out. "Ms. Dawson," he said. He glanced at Marcus, who was hovering nearby with the energy of someone watching something interesting. "Could I have a few minutes? I've got 20 on my break." "That's plenty." He paused. "Is there somewhere we could—" "Here's fine." He accepted that without blinking. "Okay." He took a breath. "How are you? Were you hurt yesterday? I didn't even think to ask." "I'm fine." "Okay. Good. He stopped. Started again. "Sophie's been asking about you since yesterday afternoon. She keeps calling you the Rain Lady, which is—" The corner of his mouth moved. "It's what it is." Despite herself, Claire felt something loosen slightly. "The Rain Lady. She's 3. Her metaphors are pretty on the nose." He set the coffee cup on the edge of the counter, then seemed to think better of it and picked it back up. "I know this is unusual. I know you don't know me. I want to be clear that I understand that." He met her eyes. "I want to offer you a job." Claire stared at him. "Sophie needs a full-time caregiver. She's had 3 nannies since—" He stopped. Reconfigured. "She's had 3 nannies in the past year, and none of them lasted longer than 6 weeks. She doesn't attach to people easily. She hasn't attached to anyone since her mother—" He stopped again, and the word died sat in the space between them, unspoken but fully present. He didn't say it. He also didn't pretend it wasn't there. "She latched onto you in about 5 minutes in the middle of a parking lot during a thunderstorm. That's—" He exhaled. "I've been in business for 12 years. I know what it looks like when something works." "I work in a grocery store," Claire said. "I know where you work. I'm not offering you this because of credentials." He looked at her steadily. "I'm offering you this because my daughter tried to climb out of the car seat to find you this morning, and she's never done that for anyone." Claire said nothing for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Somewhere in the store, a child was asking his mother loudly about which cereal he could have, and the mother was explaining tiredly that they had already talked about this. "What does the job look like?" Claire asked. "Full-time, live-out, or live-in? Your preference. You'd be at the penthouse weekdays from 7 to 6 with some flexibility depending on my schedule. The salary is—" He named a number. The number was approximately 3 times what Claire currently made annually. She kept her face very still. "I'm not trying to buy you," Alexander said, apparently reading something in her expression. "The market rate for a qualified private childcare position in this city is lower than that. But I also know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to step into something unfamiliar and trust someone you don't know, and I think that deserves compensation that reflects the actual value of the thing. I don't have a childcare background, not professional." "I know. I've never worked in a household like—" She gestured vaguely at his general being, the suit, the expensive coffee, the everything, whatever your household is like. "I know that too. So why would you—" "Because she grabbed your finger," he said simply. Claire looked at him. "In the parking lot. She reached out and grabbed your finger and didn't let go for almost a minute. Sophie doesn't do that." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not performative, just honest. "Her mother died 14 months ago. She's been struggling. There are things money fixes and there are things it doesn't. And I've been learning, slowly, which category is which." The break room clock showed 8 minutes left. Claire thought about the 3rd bill in the pile she'd been avoiding. She thought about her mother's occupational therapy appointments and the copays that had been quietly accumulating in an envelope she kept in her kitchen drawer and opened and closed without ever fully dealing with. She thought about the radiator clicking in the night. "I need a day," she said. "Of course. Maybe 2. Take what you need." She nodded once and started back toward the break room, then stopped and turned around. "The rabbit. Is Sophie still carrying the rabbit?" Alexander looked at her for a moment. "She slept with it last night, both hands." "Good," Claire said. "It's important she keeps it." She didn't explain why. She went back to work. She called her mother that evening and told her about the offer without editorializing, just the facts. The job, the child, the pay. There was a long silence on the other end. Not the kind that means disapproval, the kind that means someone is thinking carefully. She grabbed your finger, Diane said finally. He said that. Yeah. And you ran into traffic for a kid you'd never met. That's not a qualification. Claire. Her mother's voice was gentle but direct, the way it always was when she was about to say something she'd thought all the way through. You've been running toward other people's emergencies since you were about 8 years old. You're good at it. You're maybe not giving yourself enough credit for what that means. Mom. I'm not saying take it because he's rich. I'm saying take it because that little girl grabbed your finger and you're still thinking about it 2 days later. A pause. You've been surviving for years. Maybe this is what something else looks like. She took the job. She gave Marcus her 2 weeks and he made a mark in his notebook and wished her luck in a tone that suggested he was mildly baffled by the turn of events, but not upset about it. She cleaned out her locker and took the orange vest with the broken zipper home and put it in a bag for donation, which was perhaps the most optimistic act she had performed in recent memory. The morning she was supposed to start, she stood outside the Hayes building on Michigan Avenue in her best outfit, which was a dark blazer, black pants, and a pair of boots that were professional-looking from a distance and slightly beat up from close-up, and looked up at the building for long enough that a doorman came over and asked if she needed help. I'm starting work here today, she said. Name? Claire Dawson. He checked something, nodded, and held the door open. Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Penthouse elevator is to your left. She walked through the lobby of a building that contained more marble than most small towns, and tried to look like this was a normal thing she did. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. Alexander was there, in a different suit from the grocery store, holding a tablet. Sophie was behind him, half hidden behind his leg, watching the elevator doors with enormous eyes. When she saw Claire, Sophie did not run forward or squeal or do any of the things children do in stories. She stayed exactly where she was, holding the white rabbit against her chest, and she stared. Claire crouched down to eye level. Hi, Sophie. Sophie stared. I like your rabbit. Still staring. Does your rabbit have a name? A long pause. Then, very quietly, Bun. Bun, Claire repeated seriously. That's a good name. Very clear. No ambiguity. Something moved at the corner of Sophie's mouth. Not quite a smile. The possibility of one. Alexander was watching them from above with an expression Claire couldn't quite read. Something careful and private and complicated. Okay, Claire said, straightening up and looking around the penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline of the entire city spread out behind them, the high ceilings and the expensive quiet of real wealth. Where do we start? That first day was hard in ways she hadn't expected. Not because Sophie was difficult. She wasn't, exactly. She was watchful. She followed Claire from room to room at a 3-foot distance, not interacting but not leaving either. She ate the lunch Claire made without complaint, though she rearranged the blueberries into a specific pattern before eating them that Claire didn't comment on. She sat on the couch during afternoon reading time with Bun in her lap and her feet tucked under her, listening to Claire read Frog and Toad with the focused attention of someone studying for a test. The hard part was this penthouse itself. Not its size, though it was large. Not the luxury, though it was undeniable. The hard part was the particular quality of the silence inside it. A silence that had nothing to do with sound dampening or thick walls, and everything to do with a space where people had stopped filling it with noise. A space in the process of forgetting what it used to contain. On the wall of the hallway leading to Sophie's room, there were photographs. A wedding. A family. A woman with dark hair and a wide, generous smile, holding a newborn. The same woman with a toddler Sophie at the beach. The woman again, laughing at something off camera, clearly unaware the picture was being taken. Claire walked past those photographs 3 times before she stopped looking at them deliberately. Alexander came home at 6:45, which was late. He didn't apologize for being late, just appeared, still in his jacket, phone in one hand, and found Claire and Sophie on the living room floor in the middle of a fort made of couch cushions and a blanket. He stopped in the doorway. Sophie looked up from inside the fort and said, very matter-of-factly, Daddy, you're not allowed in. It's a Sophie and Claire fort. Alexander looked at Claire over the blanket barricade. Something moved through his face. something that was probably more complicated than the situation warranted. "I see," he said. "You can come in for 1 minute," Sophie said, in the tone of someone making a significant concession. "And you have to take your jacket off first." He took his jacket off and draped it over the couch arm and sat down on the floor in his dress shirt and said with complete seriousness, "Thank you for having me." Sophie scooted over to make room, and Claire, watching this man in a several $1,000 shirt sitting cross-legged on a living room floor in a blanket fort next to his daughter, thought, "Okay, this is going to be more complicated than I thought, not because of the money, because of the photographs in the hallway and the particular quality of the silence, and the way Alexander Hayes had looked when he walked in to find his daughter building forts with a stranger. Like he'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and for just a moment had the thought that he might be allowed to put it down. She tucked that thought away carefully. There was a job to do, a little girl who needed consistency and patience, and someone who showed up. That was what Claire had to offer. That was what mattered right now. She picked up Frog and Toad again and started reading aloud, and Sophie leaned against her arm, and the city glittered 40 floors below them, indifferent and enormous, doing what cities do, moving forward, carrying everything, forgetting nothing. The rain had finally stopped. The second week was harder than the first, not because anything went wrong, exactly. Nothing went dramatically wrong. It was more that the rhythm of the job revealed itself slowly, like a map unfolding, and the territory was more complicated than Claire had initially read it to be. Sophie woke up most mornings between 5:40 and 6, which was earlier than the official start of Claire's day, which meant that on the mornings Alexander had early calls, and there were many, Sophie would pad into the kitchen in her pajamas and her socks and find whoever was available. If it was Maria, the housekeeper who came Tuesdays and Fridays, Sophie would sit on the kitchen island and watch her work without speaking. If it was her father, she'd climb into his lap with Bun and stay there until he had to physically remove her to get to the shower. And if it was Claire, arriving at 6:55 and letting herself in with the key code Alexander had given her, Sophie would appear at the hallway entrance and stand there with her hair a complete disaster and her eyes still half asleep and wait. Just wait. Not demanding, not crying, just present, the way a small animal is present, checking to make sure you're real. The first time it happened, Claire hadn't known what to do with it. She'd stood in the foyer with her coat half off and a tote bag in one hand and this 3-year-old staring at her, and she'd said, "Morning, Bug," and Sophie had walked over and grabbed her hand and led her to the kitchen without explanation. Like this was already established, like it had always been the procedure. That was the thing about Sophie that Claire hadn't fully understood from the parking lot or even from the first day. The child didn't ease into things. She either didn't trust you at all or she trusted you completely, and there was apparently no gradual slope between those two states. The 3 previous nannies had never made it past the first stage. Claire had landed without entirely understanding how in the second. It was a lot to carry, more than she'd expected. She was thinking about this on a Thursday morning at the end of her second week, standing in the Hayes kitchen making oatmeal the specific way Sophie accepted it, plain, with exactly 5 blueberries arranged in a circle, not touching, when Alexander came in at 7:15 still buttoning his cufflinks. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment, watching Claire at the stove, before he said anything. "She slept through the night," he said. Claire looked up. "Yeah? She hasn't done that in 4 months. He came into the kitchen and opened the coffee cabinet. Not since before the last nanny left." Claire turned back to the oatmeal and counted blueberries. "She was tired last night. We did the park, the swings. She ran around for almost 2 hours. That helps." Apparently. He was quiet for a moment, working the coffee maker. Then, "She told me this morning that you know all the words to Baby Shark." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "She asked me if I knew it. I said no. She taught me. I was ambushed." Something that was close to a real laugh moved through his voice. "She does that. I know that now." He poured his coffee and stood at the counter. Claire plated the oatmeal and arranged the blueberries in their mandated circle and carried it to Sophie's spot at the kitchen table, where Sophie was already seated, bun propped against the juice glass, waiting with the patience of a very small person who has learned that waiting gets results. 5. Sophie said, counting the blueberries immediately. 5, Claire confirmed. Sophie picked up her spoon. Apparently everything was in order. Alexander watched this exchange from the counter. He drank his coffee. He had the look of a man doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't about numbers. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Claire started washing the pot. "Sure." "Why did you take this job?" She turned off the water and dried her hands and looked at him. He was looking back at her with a directness that she'd come to understand just how he looked at things. It wasn't aggressive, it was attentive, the way someone looks when they actually want to know the answer. "Money," she said. "Honestly, I needed the money." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." "And Sophie," she folded the dish towel, "both things can be true." "They can." He seemed to be turning something over. I've hired people before who needed the job and had the credentials and the references, and Sophie didn't. He stopped, tried a different approach. "I'm not complaining. I'm saying I don't entirely understand it, and I'm trying to." "I don't think there's much to understand," Claire said. She needed somebody to show up consistently and not disappear. Kids that age, that's basically the whole job description. The other nannies showed up consistently. Consistently isn't just physically being there. She hesitated because this was edging toward territory she wasn't sure she should be in. It's how you are when you're there, whether you're paying attention to what's actually happening with her or just managing the surface. Alexander was quiet. "I'm not criticizing whoever you hired before," Claire said quickly. "I'm just saying Sophie's a kid who needs someone to notice things. She communicates in small ways, the blueberries, for example." "The blueberries. She counts them every morning. Not because she's particular about the number. She'd eat 7 if I put 7. She counts them because it's something she can control, and she needs that. Predictable things help her." Claire shrugged. "So I make the oatmeal the same way every morning. 5 blueberries, not touching. It takes an extra 30 seconds, and it means she starts the day feeling like the world makes sense." Alexander stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't parse. Then he looked at Sophie, who was eating her oatmeal with great concentration, occasionally consulting Bun. "She told me Bun had a dream last night," he said quietly. "About the rain lady." Claire looked at her hands. "She still calls you that," he said. "Even to your face sometimes." "I know. I kind of like it." He put his mug in the sink and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I have a 7:30. I should be home by 6:30 tonight, but if something runs, I've got her," Claire said. "Go." He looked at her for a half-second longer than was entirely necessary, and then he left. Claire heard the elevator doors a minute later. Sophie looked up from her oatmeal. "Daddy forgot to say goodbye." "He was in a hurry." Sophie considered this with the philosophical gravity of a 3-year-old. "He's always in a hurry." "I know, Bug." "Does he have to be?" Claire sat down across from her and propped her chin in her hand. "I think so, yeah. For now." "Why?" "Because he's working on things. Important stuff." Sophie thought about that. She picked up her last blueberry and examined it. "More important than us?" The word us landed on the table between them like something physical. "No," Claire said carefully. "Not more important. Just different important." Sophie put the blueberry in her mouth and chewed. Apparently this answer was acceptable, because she moved on immediately to asking if there was any orange juice and had Bun had any, because Bun was thirsty. The moment passed, but Claire held on to the word for a while after. Us. Sophie had said it without thinking, without calculation, as naturally as breathing. 3-year-olds had no idea what they were doing to people. The 3rd week brought the first real complication, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Diane Hartwell, which was not Claire's mother's name, but which created a strange doubling in Claire's head that she couldn't quite shake. Diane Hartwell was Alexander's head of communications, a precise, polished woman in her late 40s who arrived at the penthouse on a Wednesday afternoon for what was apparently a standing meeting, and who looked at Claire the way certain people look at things they're not sure belong in the frame. Claire was in the kitchen with Sophie when Diane arrived. She heard the elevator, heard voices in the foyer, heard the distinctive clip of heels on marble. She didn't come out. It wasn't her business. She was cutting apples into the specific not too thin, not too thick slices Sophie preferred. another small constant in the daily liturgy of things that helped. When the kitchen door opened and Alexander leaned in, "We're going to use the office for a bit," he said. "You're okay?" "We're fine." He nodded and started to pull back, and then Diane appeared behind him, looking past him into the kitchen with a smile that was professionally warm and privately assessing. "You must be the new nanny," she said. "Caregiver," Claire said. "But, yeah." "Diane Hartwell." She didn't offer her hand. "I've heard quite a story about you." "Have you?" "The parking lot rescue. Alexander told the whole board." She tilted her head. "It was very brave." Claire was cutting apple slices. "It was just, she was in the lane." "Still." Diane's eyes moved to Sophie, who was watching the exchange with the focused attention she gave most adult interactions. Then back to Claire. The smile stayed exactly where it was. "Well, I'll let you get back to it." The kitchen door closed. Sophie looked at Claire. "She has a lot of teeth," Sophie said. Claire pressed her lips together very tightly. "Eat your apple." She thought about what Diane's presence in the building represented, which was not paranoia on her part, just practical awareness. Claire knew how she looked in this context. A grocery store worker, no relevant credentials, suddenly living adjacent to a wealthy widowed man's life 5 days a week. She knew how stories got built. She had no interest in becoming one. She was here for Sophie. That was the entire job. She needed to keep the edges of that very clean. The problem, and it was not a dramatic problem, not yet, just a low-frequency hum in the background of daily life, was that it was getting harder to think of Alexander Hayes as simply the person who had hired her, not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened. He was unfailingly professional, consistently considerate, always careful to treat her position with respect. He didn't ask personal questions she hadn't opened the door to. He thanked her for specific things rather than vague things, which she'd come to understand was actually unusual in employer-employee relationships, and reflected something about how he paid attention. When she mentioned once, offhandedly, that her mother was in a care facility in Oak Park, he'd simply nodded and asked if the facility was a good one without making it an event, without pity or performance. He was a good person. That was the problem, in a way. It was easier to keep your professional distance from people who were difficult. The complication happened on a Friday evening at the end of her 4th week. Sophie had a bad day. Nothing catastrophic, just one of those days that accumulates wrong from the beginning. She woke up cranky. She dropped Bun in the elevator, and Bun's ear got caught in the door, and the ear tore slightly, and the cry that followed was the inconsolable kind. The kind that isn't really about the ear. Claire had spent 40 minutes on the floor of Sophie's room, holding her, and then another 20 with a needle and thread she'd found in the hall closet, repairing the ear, while Sophie watched with the intensity of someone overseeing surgery. "Is Bun going to be okay?" Sophie had asked, approximately 11 times. "Bun is going to be fine," Claire said, approximately 11 times. When Alexander got home at 6:15, Sophie was asleep on the couch, with Claire's arm around her and Bun pressed against her chest. The repaired ear not quite matching the original, but holding. Claire was reading a book she'd found on the shelf. Something about behavioral economics that was above her pay grade, but interesting. And she looked up when Alexander came in and put one finger to her lips. He stopped, looked at his sleeping daughter, set his bag down very quietly. He sat in the armchair across from the couch and looked at Sophie for a long moment, the way parents look at sleeping children, like they're committing something to memory. Then he looked at Claire with the question in his expression. "Rough day," Claire said quietly. "Bun emergency." "She's okay." He glanced at the rabbit. "The ear. I fixed it. It's not pretty, but it's secure." He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at his daughter. He was still in his suit. He had the look of a man who'd been in rooms full of pressure all day and had not yet entirely left them, but who was in the process of doing so, and who found the sight of his daughter asleep on the couch, doing most of the work. "Can I tell you something?" he said. Quiet, because Sophie was sleeping, but not whispering. "Sure." She laughed yesterday, when you were doing the voices for Frog and Toad. I heard it from my office. He was looking at his hands now. It's been a while since she laughed like that. Really laughed. Where it kind of takes her by surprise. He paused. I wanted you to know that I notice." Claire didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't really a professional response to that. The appropriate thing was probably a nod and a quiet acknowledgement and a redirect to logistics, the way you'd expect from a competent employee. She knew that. Instead, she said, "She's funny. Most people underestimate how funny little kids are when you actually listen to them." "What did she say today, before the bun disaster?" "She told me that clouds are just big sky puddles and that rain is when the sky gets too full." I spent 10 minutes trying to explain the water cycle, and at the end of it she said, "Yeah, sky puddles," and went back to her drawing. Alexander looked up and something in his face shifted. And there it was, what she'd been waiting to see and also hadn't been looking for. A real smile. Not polite, not professional, not the practiced warmth of a CEO managing an interaction. An actual, unguarded, caught-off-guard smile. The kind a person makes when something lands in exactly the right place. It changed his face entirely. It lasted about 3 seconds before he seemed to notice it and pull back slightly, the familiar composure settling back into place. But those 3 seconds were there, and Claire had seen them, and she looked down at her book and turned a page she hadn't read, and told herself firmly to pay attention to what she was doing. Sophie shifted in her sleep. Her hand found Claire's arm without waking up, held it. Alexander watched this and said nothing. The room was quiet for a long time, the city going about its enormous business 40 floors below, and nobody moved. That was the night Claire admitted to herself, privately and without drama and with a specific kind of internal resignation, that keeping clean professional edges on this job was going to require active effort. Not because anything was happening, because of the way things felt when nothing in particular was happening, which was its own kind of information. She went home that night and called her mother. "You sound strange," Diane said immediately. "I don't sound strange." "Claire." "Mom, I'm fine. I'm just tired." Her mother had a highly specific sound for when she knew something was being withheld from her. It was not a word. It was a sound, and it communicated everything. "It's just a job," Claire said. "I'm sure it is," her mother said agreeably. "He's my employer." "Of course." "I'm there for Sophie." "Absolutely." "Mom, I'm just listening, sweetheart." Claire lay on her couch and stared at the ceiling. The radiator was doing its thing. "She grabbed my arm in her sleep today. She does it without waking up, like making sure I'm still there." Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "That's a child who's scared of losing people. I know. And you're trying not to be someone she loses. That's literally the job." "Sure." Another pause. "How's the father?" "Mom," it's a normal question. "He's fine. He's professional. He works a lot." She stopped. "He smiled tonight. Like, actually smiled, not the performative one." Silence. "That's it," Claire said. "That's the whole thing. It's nothing. I didn't say it was something. You were about to." "I was going to say good night," Diane said warmly. "Good night, Claire." Claire hung up the phone and remained on the couch for a while longer in the dark. She thought about the photographs in the hallway, the woman with the wide smile, the way the penthouse held its silence like something that had been asked to wait. She thought about what it took to let someone new into a space that had been shaped by grief, the specific courage required to open a door you'd been keeping closed. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but incrementally, one small room at a time, like testing weight on ice. Alexander hadn't done anything. He'd smiled at a story about his daughter and cloud physics. That was all. But Sophie held Claire's arm in her sleep, and Claire had been the one to fix Bun's ear, and the penthouse had started to smell like the vanilla extract she used in the Friday baking projects she'd introduced because Sophie was interested in mixing things. And the specific weight of all those small facts was accumulating somewhere in Claire's chest in a way she didn't have a clean category for. She was 30 years old. She'd spent 6 years organizing her life around survival. Her mother's illness, the bills, the shifts, the quiet management of a situation that didn't leave much space for anything else. She'd forgotten, or maybe she'd just stopped expecting, that things could be organized around something other than managing loss. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was absolutely clear on that. But she lay in her apartment in the dark, and she let herself acknowledge that the feeling was there, which was more than she'd done with a feeling in a while. and then she got up and washed her face and went to bed. The fifth week introduced a new variable. Alexander started coming home earlier, not dramatically earlier. 20 minutes, maybe 30. She only noticed because she'd established a reliable internal clock for the sound of the elevator, and its shifting was the kind of small data point that her brain flagged without her asking it to. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have any right to say anything about it. She just noticed. What she also noticed was that he started staying in whatever room they were in when he got home, rather than taking 20 minutes to decompress in his office first. He'd come in, lose the jacket, and sit down in the living room while Sophie finished whatever they were doing. The puzzle, the drawing, the elaborate game involving Bun, and an imaginary Tea Party bureaucracy that Sophie managed with great administrative seriousness. He watched. He participated when Sophie invited him, which was always. He talked to Claire about Sophie's day with the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand their child rather than just receive a report, asking specific follow-up questions, remembering things she'd mentioned in passing from 2 days before. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table while Claire made dinner. She'd started cooking dinner most nights after Sophie had refused 3 consecutive evenings of catered food with a 3-year-old's blunt specificity about what counted as real food versus fancy weird. And he asked her how she'd learned to cook. "My mom," she said, "she's a good cook. Was a good cook. Still is. On good days, she adjusted the heat on the pan. The Parkinson's makes the hands unpredictable. So she doesn't do it much now." "I'm sorry," he said, and it didn't have the social ritual sound it usually has when people say that. It sounded like he meant the specific thing. "She handles it better than I would," Claire said. "You think so?" Yeah, she's tougher than me. You ran into a moving traffic lane for a stranger's child. That's a different kind of tough." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup around in his hands. "What kind is it?" She thought about it. "Adrenaline tough. Anybody can do that kind if the thing in front of them is clear enough." She shook the pan. "My mom's kind is, she gets up every morning in a situation that's not going to get better, and she finds the thing worth saying, every day." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "That's harder." He looked at her steadily. "You talk about her like she hung the moon." "She did hang it," Claire said simply. "For me, anyway." Dinner was pasta with a jarred sauce she'd improved with onion and garlic and some oregano she'd found in the back of the spice cabinet, and it was not a remarkable meal in any objective sense. Sophie ate 2 full bowls and declared it better than restaurant food, which Claire knew wasn't true but appreciated anyway. Alexander asked for seconds. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the specific, ordinary domestic intimacy of people sharing a meal, and outside, the November dark came down early and fast against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city lit up below them like something out of a dream about cities rather than an actual one. At some point, Sophie fell asleep sitting up, which she sometimes did when she was fighting it too hard, and Alexander carried her to bed while Claire cleared the table. He was gone for 15 minutes, doing the full routine she knew, the specific blanket tuck, the glass of water in the exactly right position, the answering of whatever question Sophie raised at the last second to stall sleep. When he came back to the kitchen, Claire was washing the pasta pot, and he stood in the doorway with his sleeves rolled up and said, "She asked if you'd be here tomorrow." "You told her yes?" "I told her yes." He came and leaned against the counter, not uncomfortably close, just in the same space. "She also asked if Bun could have pasta next time." "Bun has specific dietary requirements," Claire said. "We've discussed it." "What are they?" "Currently, everything Claire makes. She told me this morning." He laughed, a real one, quiet and genuine, gone almost as quickly as it came. Claire kept washing the pot and didn't look at him and was very deliberately looking at the pot. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You asked me that once before." "I remember. You gave me an honest answer." She put the pot in the drying rack. "Okay." He took a breath. Not the casual preparatory kind. The kind that precedes something that's been being carried for a while. "Does this feel..." He stopped. "I mean, is it..." Another stop. She waited. "I'm aware this is a strange situation," he said finally. "The setup of it. You're here every day, and Sophie is..." She's attached to you in a way she hasn't been attached to anyone since. He stopped again on the unfinished word. I just want to make sure this is okay for you. That I'm not. That the lines are clear. Claire turned to face him. He was looking at the counter, not at her, with the careful expression of a person trying to be honest and getting in their own way doing it. The lines are clear, she said. He looked up. I'm here for Sophie, she said. That's the job. That's what I'm doing. She held his gaze. Is it okay for you? He was quiet for a moment, then, I don't entirely know how to answer that. Then maybe that's your answer. He nodded slowly. There was something exhausted in it. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the deeper kind. The tiredness of someone who has been making themselves smaller than they are for a long time, pressing their actual thoughts into the narrow space available between one obligation and the next, carrying a silence that nobody asked them to carry, but that had become load-bearing somehow. Claire picked up her bag from the hook by the door, put her coat on, paused. She's lucky, she said. Sophie, to have you. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure he believed that, which was its own form of honest. Good night, Mr. Hayes. Good night, Claire. He paused. You could call me Alexander at this point. She considered it. Maybe eventually, she said, and left. In the elevator, going down, she looked at herself in the mirrored doors. Her coat was old. Her hair needed a trim it had needed for 6 weeks. There was a small pasta sauce stain on her sleeve that she hadn't noticed during dinner. She looked like what she was, a woman who had spent the last several hours in a kitchen with a 3-year-old and a man she was doing her absolute best not to think about in any capacity beyond the professional. She was doing pretty well, she thought. Or she was doing okay. Or she was doing the reasonable best available given the actual circumstances, which were these. She had taken a job she needed, and the job had turned out to contain people who made it difficult to keep everything exactly where you put it. Outside, Chicago was cold and loud and enormous. She pulled her coat tighter and started toward the train, and the city moved around her, indifferent and bright, doing what cities do. Behind her, 40 floors up, the penthouse lights were still on. She did not look back. She almost did. She started calling him Alexander on a Tuesday in December, and neither of them made anything of it, which was the right call. It happened naturally. Sophie had knocked over a full cup of apple juice directly onto the kitchen table, the tablet, and herself. And in the chaos of grabbing towels and reassuring the crying child and saving the electronics, Claire had said, Alexander, the tablet, without thinking about it. And he'd grabbed it, and that was that. The name crossed the air between them without ceremony and landed and stayed. Afterward, when the juice was cleaned up and Sophie was in dry clothes and the tablet was confirmed functional, Alexander had looked at her briefly with something that might have been a smile starting and then returned his attention to the screen. Claire had gone back to making lunch. Neither of them mentioned it. But it was a door that had opened, and small doors, Claire was learning, were the significant ones. December in Chicago was working through its full repertoire of misery, wind that came off the lake with apparent personal hostility, temperatures that dropped into single digits on the bad days, and a gray sky that settled over the city like a lid and stayed there for stretches of a week at a time. The penthouse, 40 floors up, caught the wind in a way the street didn't. On certain mornings, the windows flexed almost imperceptibly, and Sophie had developed a habit of pressing her palm flat against the glass and feeling the cold push back against her hand. The outside is angry, she told Claire one morning, doing this. It's just cold, Claire said. Cold is angry, Sophie said, with the absolute authority of someone who had recently developed a comprehensive theory of weather as emotional state. She'd been doing this since the sky puddle conversation, assigning feelings to atmospheric events. Rain was sad. Sun was showing off. Wind was arguing. Snow, when it finally came in the second week of December, was described as the sky being too quiet and then too loud at the same time, which Claire thought was actually a pretty sophisticated read on a blizzard. She'd written it in the small notebook she kept in her bag, the one she'd started filling with Sophie-isms, partly because they were funny, partly because she thought Alexander would want to know them, and she kept forgetting to tell him everything. She'd hand the notebook to him occasionally and watch his face move through the entries without saying anything. He never commented out loud, but he read every page. The snow brought its own complications. Sophie's sleep had been improving, 2 or 3 nights a week of unbroken rest, which Alexander noted with a quiet relief that he was careful not to make superstitious by dwelling on. But the first real storm, 10 inches overnight, the city muffled and rearranged by morning, triggered something. Claire arrived at 7 to find Alexander standing outside Sophie's room with his hand raised to knock, looking like a man caught between two decisions. He turned when he heard the elevator. "She had a nightmare," he said quietly, "about an hour ago. I went in, she calmed down, went back to sleep. But now she's—" He paused. "She's awake, and she won't talk to me." Claire looked at the door. "Since when?" 40 minutes. "You've been standing here for 40 minutes? I've been in and out. She keeps saying she's fine and then not talking." His voice had the specific tension of a parent who knows something is wrong and has run out of approaches. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong." "You're not doing anything wrong." Claire set her bag down. "Can I try?" He stepped back without hesitation, which was a form of trust she didn't take lightly. She knocked lightly and pushed the door open. Sophie was sitting up in bed in the half-dark, bun in her lap, the blanket pulled up to her waist. Her eyes were dry, but her face had the closed, compressed look that Claire had come to recognize. Not tantrum-closed, but something quieter and harder. The look of a child trying to contain something too large for her. Claire sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything immediately. She picked up the corner of the blanket and looked at it like she was examining the stitching. After about 30 seconds, Sophie said, "Bun had a bad dream." "What about?" "Losing things." Claire kept examining the blanket. "That's a hard dream." "Bun got lost in a big place and couldn't find the way back." "Did Bun find the way back?" Sophie was quiet for a moment. "I woke up before." "Okay." Claire set the blanket down. "You know what I do when I have that kind of dream?" Sophie looked at her. "What?" "I make a list of things that are still here, in my head. I go through them one by one." She tapped her fingers on her knee. "My coat, my keys, my mom's voice on the phone. Things that are real and still here." Sophie considered this with total seriousness. "Does it work?" "Sometimes. Not always. But it gives your brain something to do instead of staying in the scary place." Sophie looked at Bun, then back at Claire. "Will you do it with me?" "Sure." "Your things or my things?" "Your things. You know them better." What followed was a slow, methodical list. Sophie's items, reported with great care, starting with the immediate and concrete and expanding outward. Bun. Her yellow raincoat hanging on the hook, the plate with the rabbits on it that she used at breakfast. Her father's voice. The window with the snow outside. Claire's hand, which Sophie reached out and held while she talked, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, like confirming coordinates. By the time she got to item 11, the specific smell of the vanilla baking, which she described as warm and like being inside. Her shoulders had dropped 2 inches, and her voice had gone soft, and she was listing sideways toward the pillow. Claire waited until Sophie's breathing changed. Then she stood carefully and pulled the blanket up and set Bun in the crook of her arm the way she held him in sleep, and went back to the door. Alexander was still in the hallway. He'd slid down the wall at some point and was sitting on the floor with his knees up, head back, and he looked absolutely exhausted in the specific way that had nothing to do with hours slept and everything to do with the weight of watching your child struggle with something you can't fix. He looked up when the door opened. Claire sat down next to him on the floor. It was not a decision she thought through. She just sat. "She's asleep," she said quietly. He exhaled slowly. "What did you do?" "We made a list of things that were still there." He was quiet. "It's a grounding thing," Claire said, "for anxiety. My mom taught it to me when I was a kid. You give the scared part of your brain something concrete to grab onto." "I should know that," he said, and the way he said it, low and flat, not self-pity, just a statement, told her everything about where he'd been sitting for the past 40 minutes. "You know a lot of things," she said. "Nobody knows all of them." He rubbed his face with both hands. He hadn't shaved yet, and the stubble made him look less like a CEO and more like just a person, which happened sometimes in the early mornings, and she'd stopped being surprised by it. "She doesn't tell me when she's scared," he said. "She'll tell Bun. She'll tell you. She doesn't tell me. She doesn't want you to worry. She's 3. Kids know when their parents are already carrying a lot, they try not to add to it. She looked at the door. She loves you. That's why she protects you. He turned and looked at her, and in the low-lit hallway with the snow pressing its white silence against the outside world, he looked. She didn't have a word for it. Undone wasn't right. Opened, maybe, like a window that had been painted shut for a long time and someone had finally worked the latch. I don't know how you do this, he said. Do what? See people the way you do. He shook his head slightly. You saw Sophie in about 4 days, things I've been trying to understand for months. You were too close, Claire said simply. You're her dad. You can't be neutral about her. That's not a failing. That's what it is. He nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. They sat on the floor of the hallway for another few minutes without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that happens when two people are tired enough to stop managing what they project and just exist in the same space. Then he said, Are you hungry? I can make eggs. I make bad eggs, but I can make them. How bad? Technically edible, aesthetically upsetting. She looked at him. Yeah, okay. They went to the kitchen and he made eggs that were, as advertised, technically edible and slightly gray in a way that had no clear cause. And she made toast because she couldn't let the meal be entirely at his mercy, and they sat at the kitchen table while the snow continued outside and the city was quieter than it ever usually was, muffled into something close to peace. He told her about the morning Rebecca died. He didn't plan to. She could tell by the way it came out, not organized like a story, but sequential like a memory he'd stumbled into. He'd been in Vancouver for a board meeting. Rebecca had been sick for 8 months, but the last scan had looked stable, and the doctors had used the word manageable twice in the same conversation, and he'd believed them because he'd needed to believe them. He was in a meeting room on the 42nd floor of a glass tower when his phone rang, and he saw the hospital's number and understood, from the weight of the silence before he even answered, what kind of call it was going to be. He'd gotten back to Chicago 11 hours later. Sophie was asleep at Rebecca's parents' house, and he'd held his daughter while she slept, and she'd made a small sound and reached for his collar the way she always did, the tactile locating, making sure he was solid. And he'd sat there in the dark for 4 hours because he couldn't put her down, and he couldn't cry in front of her even though she was asleep, and he had absolutely nowhere to go with what was happening inside him. He stopped, looked at his coffee cup. I've never told anyone that part, he said. The 4 hours. You don't have to explain it, Claire said. I know. He turned the cup. I've told the story before, the meeting, the call, getting home. But not that part. Claire looked at him steadily. It makes sense. You had to hold her until you knew she was okay, until you knew she was still there. Something shifted in his face. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, that's what it was. Outside, the snow was coming down in the particular way it does when it's serious. Not the light decorative kind, but the dense, committed kind that intends to stay. Sophie was asleep in her room with Bun. The penthouse was warm and still. The eggs were bad and the toast was good, and neither of them mentioned any of it. The weeks between that morning and Christmas were the weeks things changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the accumulating inevitability of water finding its level. They talked more. Not about important things necessarily. Sometimes about nothing. Sometimes about Sophie. Sometimes about whatever Alexander was reading, which was always 2 or 3 things simultaneously and ranged from quarterly reports to, inexplicably, a novel about salmon fishing in Scotland. He read the way he did everything, thoroughly and with attention. Claire had always been a reader too, mostly whatever was cheap or available, but she'd stopped in the years of her mother's illness because the concentration required had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She mentioned this once, and Alexander had said nothing, but had placed 3 days later, without comment, a novel on the kitchen counter near her bag, the kind that meant nothing or meant something, and she'd taken it without comment and read it in a week. They didn't discuss it after. He just asked one morning if she was enjoying it, and she said yes, and he nodded, and that was the whole conversation. It was the kind of exchange that looks like nothing from the outside and feels like something from the inside, and Claire was aware of this dynamic with a clarity that was both useful and inconvenient. Sophie noticed everything. This was the thing people forgot about children, that they were watching all the time, that they processed information through their bodies before their words caught up, that they knew things they had no vocabulary for. Sophie knew, in the way she knew weather had feelings and that Bun required pasta, that something was different about the kitchen in the mornings. She'd taken to sitting between Claire and her father at the table in a way that was technically spatial logic and also clearly intentional, planting herself at the exact center of whatever was happening, a small, self-appointed nexus. "You're both here," she said one morning, as if confirming a hypothesis. "Yes," Alexander said. "Good," she said, and went back to her blueberries. Claire kept her face very still. The complication arrived 8 days before Christmas, and it arrived in the form of a woman named Catherine Webb, who had cheekbones like architectural features and a personal acquaintance with Alexander that predated Rebecca by several years and had apparently never fully concluded. Claire arrived on a Monday morning to find a woman she'd never seen before sitting at the kitchen island in a silk blouse, drinking the good coffee, while Alexander stood at the counter looking like someone managing a situation. He saw Claire come in and something in his posture changed. Not relief, or not only relief, something more complicated. "Claire, this is Catherine. She's an old friend. Catherine, this is Claire, Sophie's caregiver." Catherine Webb turned and looked at Claire with a smile that was perfectly constructed and entirely opaque. "I've heard about you," she said. "The parking lot story. Quite impressive." "Hi," Claire said. "Sophie's still sleeping?" she asked Alexander, and the possessive ease in the question, the way it assumed familiarity with the household schedule, told Claire several things simultaneously. "She'll be up in a few minutes," Alexander said, addressing this to approximately the space between them. Claire went to put on Sophie's breakfast things, moving through the kitchen with the precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is and is finding that knowledge both useful and strange right now. Catherine tracked her movements with the peripheral attention of a woman who was very good at appearing not to track things. Sophie emerged from the hallway 8 minutes later, bun in tow, hair disordered, still mostly asleep, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw a stranger. "Good morning, baby," Catherine said warmly. Sophie looked at her, then at Claire, then at her father. This triangulation took approximately 4 seconds. "Who are you?" Sophie asked Catherine. "I'm a friend of your daddy's. My name is Catherine. Isn't that a pretty name?" Sophie appeared to be conducting an assessment. "Bun doesn't know you," she said. "Well," Catherine said with a practiced light laugh, "maybe Bun and I can get to know each other." Sophie walked past her and went directly to Claire and lifted her arms to be picked up, which she sometimes did in the mornings and which Claire did without thinking, and Sophie pressed her face against Claire's shoulder and looked at Catherine over it with enormous, patient eyes. It was not subtle. 3-year-olds had no interest in subtle. Claire caught Alexander's expression for just a moment. That particular mixture of things she'd learned to read, where professionalism and the actual human underneath it were conducting a disagreement. He looked briefly like he wanted to say something. He didn't. Catherine stayed for an hour and a half, and there was nothing specifically wrong with her. She was polished and pleasant and laughed at the right moments and clearly cared about Alexander in a way that was real, if complicated. But Sophie didn't warm up, which was unusual because Sophie, once the initial wariness passed, was generally a friendly child. She stayed physically close to Claire all morning and responded to Catherine's attempts at conversation with the kind of minimal, polite answers that a child produces when they've decided not to be rude, but also not to engage. When Catherine finally left, kissing Alexander's cheek and promising a dinner that week, with a glance at Claire that was not quite hostile and not quite warm, Sophie watched the elevator doors close and then turned to her father and said, in her most serious voice, "I don't like her perfume." "Sophie, it's too strong. It makes Bun sneeze." Alexander ran a hand over his face. "Bun doesn't sneeze. He does inside." Claire took Sophie to the living room for reading time before she could be drafted into this conversation. She sat on the couch with Sophie pressed against her side and opened a book and stared at the pages and thought about what she'd seen on Alexander's face in the kitchen. The things she'd noticed. He hadn't looked like a man glad to see an old friend. He'd looked like a man who'd been reminded that his life had a before and an after, and that navigating the space between them required decisions he hadn't fully made yet. That evening, after Sophie was in bed and Claire was getting her bag, Alexander stopped her at the elevator. "I should explain, you don't have to," she said. Catherine and I, it's not, he stopped. There's nothing there. There hasn't been for a long time. She visits sometimes. I don't, he exhaled. I'm not trying to explain myself. I just didn't want you to think, Alexander. She said his name with the specific weight she was trying to manage. It's not my business. He looked at her. Maybe I want it to be. The elevator came. The doors opened. Claire stood in the threshold for a moment, and neither of them said anything. And then she stepped in and pressed the lobby button and watched the doors close on his face, which had the expression of a man who had said a true thing and was in the process of understanding what that cost. She went home. She sat on her couch. She did not call her mother this time. She sat very still and let herself feel the full weight of what was accumulating. Not the idea of it, not the theoretical version, but the actual thing. The fact that this man who had hired her to care for his daughter and had therefore changed her entire material situation, and who she saw every day in the worn-down morning honesty before coffee and the late evening tiredness after long days, this man had just said something she didn't know how to put back where it came from. She was not naive about what it meant. She was also not naive about what surrounded it. Grief that was still working, a household that a small girl had organized her entire sense of safety around, a job that was both the best and most complicated thing that had happened to her in years, and her own history of taking care of everyone except herself with such thoroughness that she'd nearly forgotten there was a self to take care of. She thought about Sophie listing things that were still there. The grounding exercise against the dark. She ran her own version of it. Her apartment, small and known. Her mother's voice, the smell of vanilla baking. Sophie's hand finding her arm in the dark. The notebook full of 3-year-old weather philosophy. A novel on a kitchen counter with no note attached. The things that were real and still here. She went to bed without a conclusion, because some things didn't have conclusions yet, and forcing one was its own kind of mistake. Christmas happened the way it does when you're around children, at high volume and with aggressive sincerity. Sophie had been building anticipatory energy for 3 weeks in the way only small children do, treating the advent of the holiday as a personal project of enormous scale. She had opinions about decorations, about the tree, about which ornaments went where, about the specific cookie recipe that was the right one, and no other cookies were acceptable until those ones had been made first. Claire made the cookies. She made them on a Tuesday afternoon with Sophie on a step stool beside her, flour on both of them, and the kitchen counter, and apparently on bun, which nobody could explain. Alexander came home during the baking and stopped in the kitchen doorway, which was becoming a habit, this doorway pause. This moment of standing in the frame before entering, and looked at the scene with an expression Claire was beginning to understand as something he didn't have a word for either. You have flour, he said, addressing this to Claire specifically, on your nose. Sophie thought this was the funniest thing that had ever happened and laughed with her whole body. Claire wiped her face with her sleeve and made it worse, and Sophie laughed harder. Alexander leaned in the doorway watching the two of them, and for a moment he just let himself look at it. The flour and the noise and the cookies not quite right on the pan because Sophie had helped shape them. And his face did the thing it did sometimes. The opening thing, the window thing, the 3 seconds of unguarded reel before the composure came back. But this time it stayed a little longer. Can I help? He asked. Sophie pointed at a specific spot beside her on the floor with the authority of a foreman assigning tasks. You stand here. He took off his jacket and stood there. They burned the second batch because nobody was watching the timer, and Sophie declared that burnt cookies were actually the better kind, which was objectively false but a generous position. And Alexander ate one with the expression of someone maintaining diplomatic composure, and Claire watched him do it and had to look at the window to keep her face right. The city outside was doing its winter thing, lights and darkness and the patient cold. Inside the kitchen, it smelled like vanilla and burnt sugar and something else that didn't have a name, which was the specific warmth of people occupying a space together and choosing, without discussing it, to stay. After Sophie was in bed and the kitchen was cleaned, they'd cleaned it together, which had become a habit without being decided, the division of labor arranged itself without conversation. Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine. He set one on the counter near Claire. She didn't pick it up immediately, just looked at it. She's happy, he said. Not loudly, just as information. She is today, Claire said. Most days now. She picked up the wine. Yeah, most days. He turned and leaned back against the counter, looking at the kitchen, the cleaned surfaces, the flour that had missed the cloth in the corner by the stove, the slightly too dark cookies cooling on the rack. "Rebecca used to bake with her," he said, "before she got sick. Sophie doesn't remember it. She was too little, but I used to come home and the kitchen would be like this." He wasn't sad saying it, or he wasn't only sad. It was more complicated than that. "I'd forgotten what it felt like," he said, "to come home to this." Claire held the wine glass and didn't say anything, and let the sentence be what it was. "I know I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I know this isn't fair to put on you, the weight of it, the situation." "You're not putting anything on me," she said carefully. "I'm aware of how this looks," he said. "I'm aware that I'm your employer and that there's a power—" "Alexander." He stopped. She turned to face him and looked at him directly because he deserved that. "I'm a grown woman. I know what's happening. I'm not confused about it." She kept her voice steady. "What I am is careful, because Sophie is in this house, because she's already lost one person who mattered to her, because the only non-negotiable thing in this whole situation is that she doesn't get hurt." He was very still. "I know that." "Then we agree," she said, "on what matters most." He looked at her for a long moment, then, "And what do we do with the rest of it?" She didn't answer, because she didn't have one. She drank her wine and looked at the city and felt the warmth of the kitchen and the weight of the question hanging in the air between them, patient and impossible and entirely real. Sophie called out from her room then, not in distress, just checking, doing her coordinates thing in the dark, making sure the house still contained the people it was supposed to contain. They both moved toward the hallway at the same time, then stopped, looked at each other. "I'll go," Alexander said. Claire nodded. She listened to his footsteps down the hall, the soft push of the door, the low murmur of his voice, and Sophie's answer, drowsy and satisfied, and then silence again. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went home, through the cold and the lit-up dark, carrying the question he'd asked her, and not yet having the courage to answer it honestly, even to herself. The question he'd asked her lived in the apartment with her for the next 2 weeks. She didn't answer it. She didn't bring it up. She went to work every morning and made oatmeal with 5 blueberries and read Frog and Toad and fixed the ongoing administrative chaos of the stuffed rabbit social calendar. And Alexander went to his meetings and came home and sat on the kitchen floor in his dress shirts, and neither of them said anything about the wine glasses or the question or the particular quality of the silence that had settled between them like a third person in every room. It wasn't avoidance, exactly. It was more like 2 people who had found themselves at an edge and were standing there looking down, neither ready to jump, neither willing to step back, just existing at the threshold and pretending to be interested in the view. Sophie, who was 3 and therefore had no patience for subtlety or narrative pacing, handled this by simply proceeding as though the situation had already resolved itself in the way she preferred. She'd taken to calling them both into whatever room she was in simultaneously, staging elaborate scenarios that required exactly 2 adult participants, distributing tasks with the business-like efficiency of a project manager who had identified a resource and intended to use it. Bath time required 1 person for the water temperature and 1 person for the story. The Tower of Blocks needed 1 builder and 1 structural consultant. Bun's Medical Emergencies, an ongoing dramatic series that had been running for 3 weeks, required a doctor, which was Claire, and a worried parent, which was Alexander, whose concerned father performance Sophie critiqued with sharp specificity. "More worried," she told him once. "Bun is very sick." "How much more worried?" Sophie demonstrated an expression of theatrical parental anguish. Alexander attempted to replicate it. Sophie considered it. "Better," she said, and the game continued. Claire watched this and kept her expression neutral and thought, "You are being managed by a 3-year-old, and the worst part is, she's right." New Year's came and went quietly. Alexander had been invited to 3 different parties and declined all of them, citing Sophie, which was true, but Claire suspected not the whole truth. They watched the fireworks from the penthouse balcony, the 3 of them bundled in coats, Sophie on Alexander's shoulders with her hands over her ears because the sound was too much, her eyes enormous and reflecting the colors above the lake. Claire stood beside them and watched Sophie's face cycle through terror and wonder and back to wonder and thought. Not for the first time, that the specific joy of experiencing things through a child was something that could rearrange your internal priorities if you let it. January in Chicago was punishment weather, the kind that arrived with the specific intention of testing character. The penthouse was warm enough, but the cold pressed against the glass in a way you could feel, and the city below moved with the hunched shoulder efficiency of a population that had accepted its seasonal fate. Claire started arriving in heavier coats, started keeping a second pair of gloves in her bag, started making heavier things for dinner. Soups, stews, anything that was warm in the deep way rather than the surface way. The shift happened on a Thursday in the second week of January, and it happened because of a conversation that started about something entirely unrelated. Alexander had come home at 6, which was his new normal, and found Claire at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a spreadsheet on the screen that she closed too quickly when she heard the elevator. He noticed. He didn't say anything immediately. He went and checked on Sophie, who was in her room conducting a complex diplomatic summit between several stuffed animals over the rights to a specific section of blanket. He came back to the kitchen and looked at the closed laptop. "What were you working on?" he asked. "Nothing." "Claire." She opened the laptop. The spreadsheet was her mother's medical expenses laid against her income over the past 8 months. The kind of document you make when you're trying to understand how bad something is, and then spend time not wanting to look at after you've made it. It was bad enough to need a spreadsheet. That was the short version. He sat down across from her and looked at it without speaking. She let him look because she was too tired to perform the everything's fine routine, and also because something in the past 3 months of early mornings and kitchen floors and honest conversations had eroded her capacity for that particular pretense with this particular person. "The copays have been getting worse," she said. "They changed her medication protocol in October, and the new one isn't covered the same way. And the facility? They're good. They're really good. I don't want to move her. But the rates went up in December. Standard annual increase." She turned the laptop slightly so the numbers faced him more directly. "I've been managing it. I just wanted to know where I actually stood." Alexander looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then, "You've been managing this the whole time you've been here. It's manageable. It's just..." She closed the laptop again. "It takes up a lot of room in your head. Even when you're not looking at the spreadsheet, you're looking at it." He was quiet. She'd come to understand his silences well enough to know the difference between the ones that meant he was processing and the ones that meant he was deciding something. This one was the deciding kind, and she felt the shape of the decision coming before he said it. "Let me help," he said. "No." "Claire, that's not..." She shook her head. "That's not what this is. I'm not telling you because I need you to fix it. I'm telling you because you asked and I'm tired of pretending." He looked at her steadily. "I know you're not asking. I'm offering." "There's a line," she said. "You're my employer. That's already a complicated line to manage. If you start..." "I'm not your employer right now," he said. "Right now I'm someone sitting at a kitchen table who has more money than one person should reasonably have, and you are someone who is losing sleep over whether you can cover your mother's medication, and I don't see why those two facts have to stay in separate rooms." "Because they do." Her voice was level. "Because if you help me with this, it changes the shape of what we are to each other. It creates an obligation, or the feeling of one, and then everything gets murky and I need..." She stopped. "I need the lines to be clear. I need to know what I am here." He looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "What do you think you are here?" The question sat between them exactly like the last one had, heavy and patient and entirely sincere. She looked at her closed laptop. She looked at the kitchen, the specific kitchen that had become more familiar to her than her own, where she knew which cabinet stuck and which burner ran hot, and where Sophie had drawn on the cabinet door in crayon that nobody had quite managed to fully remove. She thought about what it meant that she knew these things, what it said about where she'd been putting herself, and whether that had been a choice or something that had just happened while she was paying attention to something else. "I don't know," she said. It was the honest answer. "Neither do I," he said. "And I think that's where we actually are." She picked up her bag. She was not going to cry at the kitchen table. She was absolutely certain of this. She was a person with functional emotional regulation and a working sense of professional context. She put her coat on. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "Claire." She stopped. "Your mother," he said it carefully. "Can I at least ask if she's doing okay?" not the expenses. Her. Is she okay? Something released in Claire's chest that she hadn't fully known was clenched. Yeah, she's good. She called me yesterday to tell me she'd won a card game against another resident, and she was insufferably smug about it. The corner of his mouth moved. She sounds like someone I'd like to meet. Claire looked at him for a second. She knows about you, she said. She's been following along. He raised his eyebrows. Following along. She asked questions. She's interested in people. Claire looked at the floor. She thinks... She stopped. She has opinions about the situation. What kind of opinions? The kind that she delivers in the tone of someone who thinks they're being subtle, but isn't. He was quiet for a beat. Then, and what do you think? Without her commentary, she looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the January wind pressed against the windows, and the city was cold and enormous and entirely indifferent. I think, she said slowly, that I came here for Sophie. And Sophie is the part I'm sure about. The rest of it... She shook her head, not in dismissal, but in honest uncertainty. The rest of it terrifies me. Not you specifically, the whole architecture of it. What it would mean if it went wrong. It doesn't have to go wrong. People always think that. Sometimes they're right. She didn't have a counter to that. She left, and on the train home she looked at her reflection in the dark window and thought about architecture. The specific word she'd used. The architecture of it. The way certain things, once built, became structural. The way you couldn't remove them without calculating what else fell. She was afraid, she admitted to herself on the cold train going south. Not of Alexander. Of herself. Of the very high likelihood that she had already, without permission, built something structural, and the question was no longer if, but only what she was going to do about the fact. The breaking point, or the opening point, depending on perspective, arrived on a Saturday in late January, and it arrived because of Marcus. She hadn't thought about Marcus, her old shift supervisor at Food Mart, since she'd cleaned out her locker. He had apparently thought about her, or specifically had been talking about her, because his girlfriend knew someone who knew someone at Hayes Global's communications department, and the specific story of the parking lot rescue had been retold enough times in enough variations that a version of it had ended up in a column in a local lifestyle blog with the headline, Chicago's Cinderella? Sources say Hayes CEO has a new someone. Claire found out about it from her phone at 7:30 on a Saturday morning because 3 people had sent her the link with varying degrees of urgency. She sat on the edge of her bed and read the thing, which was mostly speculation dressed as reporting, and felt the cold specific feeling of having a private situation become public property. She went to work anyway. She arrived at 8, which was earlier than usual on Saturdays, and Alexander was in the kitchen with Sophie when she came in, making the famously bad eggs that Sophie ate without complaint because she had no basis for comparison. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. "You saw it," he said. "Yes." Sophie looked between them. "Saw what?" "Something on the computer," Alexander said, eyes still on Claire. "Grown-up stuff." Sophie accepted this and returned to her eggs. Claire set her bag down and stood at the counter. She was trying to decide how she felt about it, which was multiple things simultaneously. Invaded, which was probably irrational, scared, which wasn't, and underneath both of those, something she didn't immediately name. "It's going to be managed," Alexander said. "Diane is already—" "I know it'll be managed," Claire said. "That's not—" She glanced at Sophie. "Can we talk about this later?" He nodded. Later was after Sophie's nap, when Sophie was deeply unconscious and would be for at least 90 minutes. They stood in the living room with the city behind them, and Alexander said, "I'm sorry. This is my world and you didn't sign up for it, and I'm sorry it's landing on you. It's not your fault someone wrote about it. It's my fault for being a person people write about." He ran a hand through his hair. "Does it change anything for you, working here?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "What it does is make things visible that I've been managing privately, and that's—" She stopped. "That's uncomfortable. Because of what it implies. Because of what it says out loud." She looked at him. "When something is private, it's yours. You get to decide what it means and when it matters. When it's public, people decide for you," he said. Yeah. He looked at her steadily. What does it mean? To you? What we are? He held up a hand. I'm not asking for a declaration. I'm asking because I've been asking that question in my head for weeks, and I'm tired of not asking it out loud. She sat down on the couch because she needed to be lower to the ground for this. He sat in the armchair across from her, not close, deliberate about the distance, giving her room. My whole life, she said, I've been the person who takes care of things. That's not a complaint. It's just, that's the role I've had. My mom got sick and I handled it. The bills got bad and I managed it. The jobs were hard and I showed up anyway. She looked at her hands. I'm good at absorbing things. I'm not very good at being, she searched for the word, being on the receiving end of anything. It makes me nervous, like there's a cost I'm not seeing yet. There's always a cost, he said. That's not the question. The question is whether what you get is worth what it costs. Easy to say when you have enough to absorb the cost either way. It came out sharper than she intended. She heard it as soon as it left her and opened her mouth to walk it back. You're right, he said before she could. That was a glib thing to say. I have resources that mean my mistakes don't permanently damage me. You don't have that buffer. I understand why that changes the calculation. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to stop calculating. I'm asking you what you actually want. Separate from what's smart and what's safe, and what makes sense on a spreadsheet. She looked at him for a long time, what she actually wanted. The question was so simple and so completely outside her normal operating framework that she almost laughed. She had spent so long wanting things that were pragmatic and achievable and relevant to survival that she'd lost the habit of wanting things that were just wanted. Things with no practical justification. I don't know how to answer that cleanly, she said. Then don't answer it cleanly. She looked at her hands again. I think about you when I'm not here, she said quietly. Not in a... She stopped. I think about a story I'm going to tell you, about something Sophie did, or something I read. I think about... She stopped again, frustrated with herself, the way you get frustrated when your vocabulary is failing you on something important. I come in every morning and you're standing in the kitchen making bad eggs and you look like the most non-CEO version of yourself and I... She stopped. I like that, she finished. I like who you are at 7 in the morning before you've turned the professional thing back on. I like the person who sits on hallway floors and eats burnt cookies and reads about salmon fishing for reasons he can't explain. Benshamtets, he was very still. And I'm terrified of that, she said, because you're my employer, and you're a man whose wife died and who has a daughter who has organized her entire sense of safety around our daily routine, and I'm someone whose life got better because of you in a way that makes it very hard to know if what I feel is... She stopped. Real, or just gratitude with nowhere else to go. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved against the glass. A car alarm went off 40 floors below and silenced itself. It's real, he said. You can't know that. I know it from my side. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, looking at her with the specific directness she'd come to understand as just how he was. You want to know what I think about when I'm not in this room? Meetings that should have ended an hour ago. The way you argued with Sophie about whether dinosaurs had feelings. She won, by the way. I think dinosaurs had feelings. The look on your face when you're reading something interesting and you think nobody's watching. Nandia-san, he paused. I think about the parking lot. I have thought about the parking lot every single day since it happened, and it stopped being about what you did for Sophie somewhere around week 3. And I know that's... He exhaled. I know the timing is complicated. I know the power dynamic is complicated. I know I'm a widower with a 3-year-old and a life that's been a construction site for 14 months. I'm not asking you to overlook any of that. Then what are you asking? He looked at her. I'm asking if we can stop pretending we don't both know what's happening here. The sentence was simple and devastatingly accurate and landed precisely on everything she'd been carrying for weeks and had been refusing to set down. Sophie made a sound from her room, not waking up, just the shift in sigh that meant she was deep in the middle of a good sleep. Both of them turned toward the sound automatically, that parental instinct that Claire had somehow acquired without noticing it happen. Both of them turned back. Okay, Claire said. He looked at her carefully. Okay, as in, I'm not pretending anymore. She met his eyes. I don't know what that means practically. I don't know how it works with the job, or what Sophie needs, or any of the 100 things that are genuinely complicated about this. But okay. Something moved through his face, not triumph, nothing like that. Something quieter and more careful. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a long time. We figure out the rest as we go, he said. I'm not great at as we go, she said. I'm a spreadsheet person. I know. The corner of his mouth moved. I've seen your spreadsheets. They're very thorough. She looked at him for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest. Not everything, not all at once, but a beginning. The particular feeling of a thing that has been held too tight being allowed, slowly, to expand. We have to be careful, she said. With Sophie. She can't… I know, he said. First, always first. We don't move faster than she can handle. And if it doesn't work, then we handle it like adults. He held her gaze. I'm not going to blow up your life, Claire. I'm not that person. She believed him, which was its own kind of remarkable thing, given how little practice she'd had at believing people who said things like that. February arrived the way it always does in Chicago, aggressively, without apology. But February also brought things that March and April would eventually confirm. Sophie started laughing the deep laugh more often. She stopped asking whether people were coming back every time someone left the room. She started sleeping through the night with reliability rather than luck. And on the morning she woke up early, she went to the kitchen and waited with a patience that had replaced the anxious hovering of the first weeks. The three of them settled into a shape that wasn't anything official or named, but that was real in the way that things built gradually out of daily life are real. Sturdier than the dramatic kind, harder to dismantle, made of accumulated mornings and bad eggs and fixed rabbit ears, and 10,000 small particular moments that didn't look like anything from outside but were, from inside, the actual substance of something. Alexander and Claire were careful. They were careful the way adults are careful when they understand what's at stake. Not cold, not distant, but deliberate. No declarations in front of Sophie. No changes to the routine that would raise a flag. The thing between them existed in small exchanges and parallel proximity, and the specific warmth of two people who have stopped pretending, which is different from the warmth of people who have figured everything out. They hadn't figured anything out. They were just present, honestly, in the same space. But children know things. Sophie knew things. She demonstrated this on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-February when Alexander came home, and Claire was helping her with a puzzle, and Sophie looked up from the puzzle and said, as though completing a thought she'd been working on for some time, I think you should stay, Claire. Claire looked up. I'm here until 6, Bug. Not today, Sophie said. She was fitting a piece into the puzzle with great concentration. I mean, like, here. She put the piece in. Like us. The kitchen was very quiet. Alexander was in the doorway. He looked at Claire. Claire looked at the puzzle. Sophie, Alexander started. Bun thinks so too, Sophie said, preemptively deploying her most authoritative source. She looked up at Claire with the clear, uncluttered eyes of a child who had made a decision about something and was reporting the outcome. You make the oatmeal right, and you fixed Bun's ear, and you do the list thing when it's scary. She returned to the puzzle. So you should stay. The logic was airtight, as Sophie's logic tended to be, built entirely from evidence, devoid of anything extraneous, arriving at conclusions that adults spent months circling. Claire looked at the puzzle. She looked at Bun, propped against Sophie's knee, the repaired ear slightly off angle. She looked at Alexander, who was leaning in the doorway with an expression she had no category for, and didn't try to force into one. I think, Claire said carefully, that's something your dad and I would have to talk about. Okay, Sophie said, as if this were an expected procedural step. You can talk about it at dinner. She found the next puzzle piece. Dinner that night was the pasta again. The same jarred sauce improved the same way because Sophie had declared it the official dinner and Claire had no particular interest in arguing. They ate at the kitchen table in the ordinary particular intimacy of shared meals, and Sophie narrated a complex story about something Bun had dreamed the previous night that involved a flying boat and a talking lamp, and neither of the adults at the table said anything about what had happened in the living room, because there was nothing to say yet, and they both knew it. But after dinner, after the table was cleared and Sophie was in the bath with her fleet of rubber animals, Claire was at the counter wrapping leftover pasta, and Alexander was drying the pot, and he said quietly, so it wouldn't carry down the hall, "She's not wrong." Claire kept her eyes on the container she was sealing. "I know. I'm not saying—" He put the pot away. "I'm not trying to move things faster than they should go." "I know," she said again. "But I want you to know that what she said—" He paused. "It's not just her. It's—" He turned to face her. "It's what I think. In whatever way I'm allowed to say that right now." She looked at him across the kitchen counter. The pasta was sealed. The pot was away. The sound of Sophie's bath narration came faintly from down the hall. Something about a rubber duck's position on international waters. "I need time," Claire said. "Not as a no, as a fact." "I have time," he said. "I have all of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put the pasta in the refrigerator and picked up her bag and called goodnight down the hall where Sophie's bath was conducting its ongoing diplomatic proceedings. "Night, Claire," Sophie called back. "Night Bun says too." She let herself out into the cold of the hallway, into the elevator, into the marble lobby, into the February air that hit her face like a reminder that the world outside the penthouse was still there, and still cold, and still entirely indifferent to whatever was happening on the 40th floor. She walked a block before she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk in the wind and she looked up at the building, not at any specific window, just at the structure of it, the lit-up floors, the building going about its enormous high business 40 stories above the street. She thought about the parking lot, the yellow raincoat, the rabbit clutched in wet small hands, the moment she'd run without thinking and the sound of brakes and the feeling of a small body pressed against her chest deciding, in about 45 seconds, that she was safe. She thought about all the things she'd told herself in the months since, that it was just a job, that the lines were clear, that she knew exactly what she was there for. And she thought about how most of that had been true in the early weeks before the hallway floors and the burnt cookies and the notebook full of 3-year-old philosophy and the wine glasses and the question that had lived in her apartment for 2 weeks. She had told herself she was protecting Sophie, and she was. But she was also, she admitted to herself, standing on a Chicago sidewalk in February wind, protecting herself from wanting something she wasn't sure she was allowed to want, from reaching for something that had no guarantee attached, from stepping fully into a life that was nothing like the one she'd planned. The problem was that the life she'd planned had been designed entirely around not losing things, not around gaining anything. And somewhere in a penthouse that smelled like vanilla baking, something had already been gained, whether she'd authorized it or not. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. Diane answered on the second ring. "It's 9 o'clock, she said, not accusingly, just noting. "I know, I'm sorry." Claire walked toward the train. "Mom, I think I'm in love with him." A pause. Then Diane said, in the warmest possible version of "I told you so." "I know, sweetheart. It's a terrible idea. Most of the good ones are. He has a daughter. He's my employer. His whole life is—" "Claire." Her mother's voice was gentle. "Tell me one thing. When you're there, when you're in that kitchen, when you're with that little girl, when you're talking to him at whatever hour you've been talking to him, Mom, does it feel like home?" She stopped walking. The wind went around her. People passed on either side with their heads down and their collars up, going wherever they were going, the city moving at its permanent velocity. She thought about the oatmeal with 5 blueberries, the broken radiator clicking in her actual apartment, the notebook, the burnt cookies, Sophie's hand finding her arm in the dark. "Yes," she said. Diane said nothing for a moment. Then maybe that's your answer." Claire stood still for another 3 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket and turned around and walked back toward the building, back through the lobby with its unreasonable marble, back into the elevator, back up 40 floors. And when the doors opened, she was standing in the foyer, and Alexander was standing in the kitchen doorway with his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who was not entirely surprised and entirely glad. "I forgot my scarf," she said. They both knew she hadn't worn a scarf. "I'll get it," he said. Neither of them moved. She walked into the kitchen and he turned as she came in and she said, "I'm not good at this. I want you to know that up front. I'm not romantic and I overthink everything, and I've spent 6 years in crisis mode and I'm probably going to be weird about the money stuff for a long time." "I know," he said. "And Sophie comes first. That's not negotiable and it's not going to change." "I know that too. And I need it to be slow," she said. "Not because I'm unsure, because I need it to be built properly." He looked at her with something so direct and unguarded that it was almost difficult to hold. "Then we build it properly," he said. "We take whatever time it takes." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm, the city was cold. Down the hall, Sophie was asleep with Bun pressed to her chest, the repaired ear pointing slightly sideways, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be. Claire Dawson, who had spent 30 years being the person who ran toward other people's emergencies and very rarely let anyone run toward hers, stood in a kitchen 40 floors above Chicago and let the feeling that had been building for months be what it actually was. She didn't say "I love you." That came later, carefully, at the right time. But she stood there in the warm kitchen and let it be real, and that was the beginning of the rest of it. The scarf, it turned out, was on the hook by the door where she'd left it. She didn't take it home that night. The scarf stayed on the hook for 3 weeks. Not because anyone forgot it, because it had become a kind of joke between them. The kind of private, low-key joke that forms in the early stage of something real, when you're both still learning the specific grammar of each other's humor. Claire would occasionally gesture at it while putting her coat on, and Alexander would occasionally say, "You can take it anytime," and neither of them would do anything about it. And Sophie had at some point decided the scarf was a permanent installation and had hung one of Bun's accessories next to it in solidarity. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of small thing that meant everything was shifting, slowly, carefully, the way Claire had asked for, the way Alexander had agreed to. Not a sudden reorganization of the universe, just the daily accumulation of a different understanding between two people who had earned their caution and were choosing, in spite of it, to move towards something. They did not rush. Claire had meant it when she said she needed it built properly, and Alexander had meant it when he said they had time, and the thing that happened over the following weeks was less like a romance in the conventional sense, and more like two people learning to trust the ground under their feet before they put their full weight on it. He texted her sometimes in the evenings. Nothing significant, a link to something she'd mentioned, a question about Sophie's nap schedule, occasionally a photograph of something absurd he'd encountered in a meeting that he knew would make her laugh. She texted back. The conversations were small and then sometimes not small, going later than either of them had planned, and she'd look at her phone at 11:30 and realize she'd been sitting on her couch in the dark, talking to him for 2 hours about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of information. The first time he reached for her hand, really reached, intentional and unhurried, was on a Saturday afternoon in March when the three of them were at the Lincoln Park Conservatory, which had been Sophie's choice on the grounds that she wanted to see flowers, because winter was, in her authoritative view, taking too long. The conservatory was warm and green and smelled like soil and growing things, which was startling after months of Chicago cold, and Sophie had moved through it with the reverence of someone visiting somewhere sacred, stopping at each plant to consult with Bun about its qualities. They'd been walking side by side behind her, close in the way you walk in a narrow greenhouse path, and at some point Alexander had reached over and taken her hand without ceremony or announcement, the way people do when they have decided something, and the decision is so settled there's no performance required. She'd looked down at it, then up at him Nim. He was watching Sophie examine a large tropical plant with approximately the same expression Bun got when confronted with important decisions. She didn't pull her hand back. She held it. They walked the rest of the conservatory like that, slowly following a 3-year-old's plant-by-plant itinerary, and it was not a grand gesture, and it was not a revelation, and it was exactly right. Sophie noticed on the way out. She looked at their joined hands with the expression of someone confirming a hypothesis they'd held for some time, said nothing, and took Claire's other hand so that the three of them walked out into the March cold in a row. The complications were real, though, and Claire would have been lying to herself if she'd pretended otherwise. The Hayes Global Board had opinions. She became aware of this gradually, through the particular way Alexander would come home occasionally with a specific quality of tiredness that wasn't about hours worked, a tighter quality, more defended. She didn't push. She waited until he brought it up himself, which he did on a Tuesday evening in late March, when Sophie was asleep, and they were sitting in the living room with tea. Neither of them was drinking. "Richard Coates asked me about you today," he said. Richard Coates was the chairman of Hayes Global's board. She'd never met him, but she knew the name from the way Alexander said it. The name of a person who was powerful in a way that created ongoing maintenance. What did he ask? Whether I was being careful. He turned the mug in his hands. He was diplomatic about it. Richard is always diplomatic. But the subtext was whether a personal involvement with someone in my employ was a liability, reputationally, legally. He looked at her. I told him it was my private life. How did he take that? He said he respected that, and then spent 20 minutes being very polite about it. The corner of his mouth lifted without humor. He's not wrong about the exposure. A company my size, a situation that could look like... He stopped. I just want you to know that it exists. The external pressure. It's not coming from me, but it exists. Claire thought about this. What does it mean practically? Practically, it means that at some point, not now, not this week, but at some point we'd need to restructure the employment arrangement. If this becomes what I think it's going to become, you can't also be on my payroll. The optics are... He stopped again. That's not a conversation for tonight. I'm telling you because I don't want you to find out through the grapevine. She looked at the untouched tea. So at some point you'd have to fire me. I'd have to find someone else for the role, yes. Someone else for Sophie. He was quiet. That's not nothing, she said. I know. Sophie's already been through 3 people. She stopped. She's finally stable. She's finally sleeping. She trusts the routine. If you introduce a new caregiver... I know all of this, he said. I'm not proposing to do it tomorrow. I'm telling you the shape of what's ahead so you can decide if it's... He paused. So you can factor it in. She sat with it for a while. Outside, March was doing something ambiguous. Not quite winter anymore. Not quite anything else. The lake was visible from where she sat, dark and enormous, and not caring about any of this. When the time comes, she said slowly, the transition would have to be gradual. Sophie would need to be involved in it, not handed off, transitioned, with her input at her pace. Agreed. And whoever comes in would need to understand the specific things, the blueberries, the... Claire. His voice was quiet. I know. She looked at him. This is the part that scares me most, she said. Not the board, not the optics, this, that loving you means eventually leaving her in the professional sense before she's fully... She stopped. She's not going to lose you, he said. She'd lose the professional arrangement, not you. He leaned forward. You understand that's not the same thing. I know it's not the same thing theoretically, she said. Sophie might not see the distinction. Then we explain it to her in a way she can hold, he said. We do it right. We don't disappear anything. He held her gaze. I spent 14 months watching this child try to understand that her mother was there and then wasn't. I'm not going to let her experience that again with anyone. Not if I can do anything about it. She believed him. And believing him required a kind of faith that didn't come naturally to her. The kind that wasn't based on evidence or logic, but on reading a person's character over hundreds of ordinary days and concluding, without a spreadsheet, that they meant what they said. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat with the untouched tea and the view of the dark lake, and it wasn't resolved. Complications never fully resolve. They just become manageable. But it was on the table, honestly, between 2 people who had agreed to stop keeping hard things in separate rooms. The thing that happened with Catherine Webb was a smaller crisis than it felt like at the time, which Claire only understood in retrospect. Catherine called Alexander in April. Claire was in the kitchen with Sophie when she heard the low exchange in the hallway, the tone of it contained and measured in the way voices get when someone is trying to manage a conversation without it becoming a scene. She didn't eavesdrop deliberately. She heard what she heard. She caught, I think you've made a mistake and she's not... And then Alexander's voice, quieter, saying something she didn't catch. He came into the kitchen 10 minutes later. His face was composed, but the composure was the working kind, not the resting kind. Sophie was drawing at the table. Claire was doing the dishes. Everything okay? Claire asked. She kept her voice level because Sophie was right there, and Sophie's antennae were always up. It will be, he said. Later, after Sophie was in bed, Catherine thinks I'm making a mistake. He was direct about it, which she appreciated. She said some things that were... She's not entirely wrong about the complications. She's wrong about the conclusion she draws from them. What's the conclusion? That the whole thing is a liability. That I'm... He paused. That I'm confusing gratitude with something else. That Rebecca's death left a gap, and you walked into it at the right moment. Claire looked at the floor. She might have a point. No, he said, without hesitation. Alexander, I've thought about that, he said. I've thought about it more carefully than Catherine gives me credit for. Gratitude for what you did in that parking lot? Yes, that was real and immediate. But that was a year ago. What I feel now has nothing to do with what happened in a parking lot. It has to do with who you are at 7 in the morning and who you are when Sophie's scared and who you are when you're being honest about something hard and don't want to be. He looked at her steadily. That's not a gap being filled. That's a specific person being specifically known. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I had the same doubt. Not because of Catherine. On my own. I know you did. Whether I'd have felt this way if I'd met you somewhere else, if the power dynamic were different, if I'd had... She stopped. If I'd had more options. And? She looked at him. I think I would have. Eventually. You're hard to miss as a person, once the suit's off and the eggs are burnt. She said it flatly, not romantically, and he almost smiled. But I also think it would have taken longer. The situation compressed things, put us in a kitchen together every day, made the ordinary stuff happen fast. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I think that's just how some things happen. Not less real for being fast, just different timing. He nodded slowly. Catherine isn't a bad person, he said. She cared about Rebecca. She cares about Sophie. She's wrong about this, but she's not malicious. I know, Claire said. I can tell the difference. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? You've asked me that 4 times, and it's never been a simple question. It's not a simple question. Go ahead. He was quiet for a moment, gathering it. Do you think she would have been okay with this? He said it carefully, looking at his hands. I know that's probably an unanswerable thing. I know I can't know. But I think about it. The question sat between them with all its weight. Claire didn't answer immediately. She thought about the photographs in the hallway. The woman with the wide smile, laughing at something off camera. She thought about what she'd understood about Rebecca Hayes from those photographs, and from the things Alexander said and didn't say about her, and from the way Sophie held her memory. A woman who had loved her family hard and hadn't had enough time. I think, Claire said carefully, that someone who loved Sophie the way she did would want her to be okay, whatever that required. She paused. And I think someone who loved you would want you to stop living in the aftermath forever. She met his eyes. That's what I think. I could be completely wrong. He was quiet for a long time. You're not wrong, he said finally. The board situation resolved, imperfectly and with ongoing management, the way board situations do. Richard Coates remained diplomatically opinionated. Diane Hartwell, who had clocked the whole situation from the beginning with the attentiveness of someone whose job was managing what people thought about Alexander Hayes, eventually shifted from watchful skepticism to something closer to careful neutrality, and Claire counted that as a reasonable outcome. The employment restructuring happened in May, 3 months after the conversation in the living room. Claire had been the one to raise it, not because she was ready to stop working, but because she understood that the current arrangement was creating a structural dishonesty that wasn't good for anyone, least of all Sophie. You couldn't be the paid caregiver and the person the father was falling in love with. The categories didn't coexist cleanly. The lines she'd needed to be clear had become, by nature of what was happening, permanently blurred. She raised it on a Saturday morning, which was not a workday. She'd come over anyway. This had become normal, the line between workday and not blurring on weekends naturally, which was itself evidence of the thing she was about to say. I think we need to find someone else for Sophie, she said. Alexander looked up from his coffee. Not immediately, she said quickly. I'm not going anywhere. But the job and the rest of it, they can't both be true at the same time anymore. And if I had to choose what's more true, you're not choosing against Sophie, he said. I know, but Sophie needs to understand that too. They told Sophie together, which was Alexander's suggestion and the right call. They sat on the living room floor, the place where most of the important things seemed to happen in this apartment. And Alexander started by asking Sophie if she remembered when Claire had first come to live with them. She came in the elevator, Sophie said, and she knew about blueberries. She did, he said, and she's been here every day since. Except weekends, Sophie said, but also sometimes weekends. Right. He took a breath. We're going to find someone new to be here during the days with you. A new caregiver. Someone kind who you can teach about the blueberries. Sophie looked at him, then at Claire. Her face had the particular stillness that meant she was processing something. Is Claire leaving? She said. No, Claire said immediately, because that was the most important word in the sentence. I'm not leaving. I'm just changing what I am here. She looked at Sophie directly. Do you know how sometimes a thing can be true and then it grows into a different kind of true? Like how Bun started as just a rabbit, and now he's also your advisor and your doctor and your diplomatic envoy. And my best friend, Sophie added. Right, he grew into more things. Claire held her gaze. I started here as the person who makes the oatmeal and reads the stories, and that's going to grow into something else. Something more. She paused. I'm not going to be the person who comes at 7 and leaves at 6 anymore. I'm going to be... She looked at Alexander briefly and then back at Sophie. I'm going to be here in a different way. Sophie looked at their joined hands, which she'd apparently noticed at some point without commenting on. Then she looked at Claire. Then at Bun. Like family? She asked. The word was so simple and so complete and so exactly accurate that it took Claire a moment to answer it. Yeah, she said. Like family. Sophie appeared to run a full internal assessment. It took about 10 seconds. Okay, she said, then, the new person has to know about the blueberries on the first day. Last time the person put them on top and they touched the oatmeal, and it was wrong. We'll brief them thoroughly, Alexander said. Can I interview them? Absolutely. Sophie nodded with the satisfaction of an executive who has concluded a productive meeting. She picked up Bun and went back to her drawing. The matter settled in the efficient way Sophie settled things, completely, without residue, and with immediate redirection to the next priority. Claire looked at Alexander. He looked at her. Something that had been tightly coiled for months released, quietly, all the way down. The new caregiver was a woman named Patricia Okoye, who had 15 years of experience, a specific gift for the kind of patient attentiveness Sophie required, and who sat through Sophie's interview with the gravitas the situation demanded. Sophie asked her 4 questions: whether she liked rabbits, whether she knew how to fix things, whether she could do voices while reading, and whether she agreed that clouds were sky puddles. Patricia said yes to all 4, and when she said the last one without blinking, Sophie turned to Claire with an expression of vindicated certainty and said, She knows. The transition took 6 weeks. Claire had insisted on that. Not a handoff, a transition. She overlapped with Patricia every day for 2 weeks, then every other day for 2 more, then just Fridays for the final 2, until Sophie had established the same coordinates with Patricia that she'd established with Claire in the early weeks. The blueberries, the list, the routines that formed the reliable architecture of a small person's daily sense of safety. Claire was there on the last official day, and Sophie was fine. Not without feeling, Sophie was always with feeling, but fundamentally fine in the way that children are fine when the important things have been preserved. The people she loved were still in the building. The rabbit's ear was still repaired. The oatmeal was still right. The wedding was not large. Neither of them wanted large. They'd talked about it in the characteristically unromantic way they'd talked about most things. Practically first, then honestly, then arriving somewhere that felt true. I don't want a production, Claire had said. I had a whole childhood of watching productions fail to mean anything. What do you want? She'd thought about it. People who actually know us. The roof, the city. A pause. Sophie with the rabbit. He'd looked at her with that specific expression she'd come to think of as the real one. The one underneath the CEO, the one that showed up in kitchens at 7 in the morning. That's exactly what I want. It was a June evening, warm for Chicago, the kind of warmth that feels like something being given back after a long deprivation. The rooftop of the Hayes building had been set simply, white lights strung across the edges, flowers and colors Sophie had chosen with absolute authority, and some arguable aesthetic choices that had been honored entirely. 40 people, maybe slightly more, Alexander's closest colleagues, Claire's mother Diane, in a chair near the front with a look on her face that was so specifically I knew it that Claire had nearly laughed during the processional. Patricia was there with Sophie, and Sophie was in a pale yellow dress she'd picked herself because yellow was the color of her raincoat, and the raincoat was important to the story, as she'd explained to anyone who asked. She carried Bun in one arm and a small basket of flower petals in the other hand, and she walked the aisle with the serious ceremony of someone who understood the weight of the occasion and intended to honor it. When she reached the front, she went to Claire and took her hand and held it, standing beside her for the ceremony the way she'd decided she was going to stand beside her. Not because anyone had told her to, but because she had made a determination about her place in this specific event, and no one had any interest in arguing. The officiant was a judge, a friend of Alexander's from law school, who kept it short and human and real. There were no words about fate or destiny or the universe arranging things. There were words about choice, the specific, repeated, daily choice to turn toward someone, to show up, to stay. Alexander held Claire's hands and said what he'd been composing for weeks and delivered without notes. I spent 1.5 years building walls around everything that mattered to me because I didn't know how else to protect it. You didn't knock them down. You just stood on the other side of them so long, being so consistently yourself, that I stopped being able to remember why I'd put them up. His voice was steady and honest and slightly rough at the edges, which was the truest version of him. I love who you are with Sophie. I love who you are with your mother. I love who you are at 7 a.m. when I make the terrible eggs and you eat them without lying about their quality. A sound from the gathered guests, affectionate, genuine. I love that you're brave in the specific way that doesn't announce itself, that you just run when running is required. He paused. I'm done asking whether I'm allowed to have this. I'm just glad I do. Claire had planned what she was going to say, and then, standing in front of him with Sophie's hand in hers, and the city lit up below them, and her mother watching from the front row, said none of it. What came out was, I was surviving when I met you. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean, I had reduced my life to the things I could manage, the bills, the shifts, the minimum necessary to keep everything running. She looked at him. You didn't rescue me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Sophie grabbed my finger in a parking lot and you offered me a job and I made my own choices from there. Sophie, hearing her name, looked up. Claire squeezed her hand. But you gave me back the idea that things could be more than manageable, that a life could be generous, full. She stopped. I spent a long time thinking I wasn't the person good things happened to. I think I was wrong about that. She paused. I'm glad I was wrong about that. The judge pronounced them married in the warm June evening, and Sophie said loudly and without ceremony, Now you're the same family as me, and nobody disputed this. Diane, in her chair, was smiling with the full force of a woman who had been right about something for a long time and was finally allowed to say so out loud. She'd met Alexander 3 times in the months prior, and the two of them had developed a rapport that Claire found simultaneously heartwarming and slightly suspicious. They texted each other, she'd discovered, independently, about things that were none of their business, and both of them thought this was fine. After the ceremony and the warm noise of the reception, Claire made her way to her mother's side. Diane looked up at her with clear eyes and took both her hands. Well, Diane said. Don't say I told you so, Claire said. I would never. You've been saying it internally for 6 months. At least, Diane agreed. Claire sat beside her and looked out at the rooftop, at Alexander talking with a group of people, easy and warm in a way he hadn't been in that grocery store parking lot, the weight in his posture different, lighter. At Sophie making her way through the guests like a small official, bun in one arm, accepting congratulations with the dignity of someone who had engineered the outcome. At the city below them, doing what Chicago always did, enormous and indifferent and lit up against the dark. Are you happy? Her mother asked. It was such a simple question. Claire had spent most of her adult life with complicated answers to simple questions. This one, she found, wasn't complicated. Yeah, she said. I actually am. Diane squeezed her hands. Good, she said. And that was all she said. And it was enough. Later that night, after the guests had gone, and Sophie had been put to bed, not without negotiation, and not without Bunn requiring his own formal installation, and not without 3 separate last questions from Sophie about the logistics of being a family now, which Alexander had answered with the patient seriousness they deserved. Alexander and Claire stood on the balcony. The city was doing its late-night thing below them. Not quiet. Chicago was never actually quiet, but a lower frequency. The daytime noise replaced by something slower and more scattered. Lights on the lake. The distant bass note of the city's machinery running on through the dark. Alexander had taken his jacket off. Claire had taken her shoes off. They stood at the railing and looked at the city, and neither of them said anything for a while. I keep thinking about the parking lot, he said. Me too. Do you think about it differently now? She considered it. I think about how close it was, she said. How many things had to happen in a specific order for any of it to occur? I was on that shift because someone called in sick. I was in the parking lot because Marcus wouldn't fix the vest zipper, and I'd procrastinated going out for 20 minutes, and by the time I went out, the carts had drifted to that end. She looked at the city. If any of those things had been different, they weren't, he said. No, they weren't. He looked at her sideways. Do you believe in that kind of thing? Everything happening for a reason? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. I believe that things happen, she said, and that what you do with them is the part that matters. Sophie was in that lane. I ran. You offered me a job. I took it. She turned to look at him. Every step was a choice, not a destiny, a choice. He nodded slowly. I like that version better anyway. Because it means we get credit? Because it means it was actually us, he said, not something happening to us. Us deciding. She looked at him. In the half-light of the city, with his jacket off and his tie loosened and the composed professional surface entirely absent, he looked exactly like the person she'd been falling in love with for months. Specifically human, specifically imperfect, specifically known. We should go in, she said. Sophie's going to be up at 5:30 claiming Bunn had a diplomatic crisis. She will, he agreed. Neither of them moved. The city ran on below them. The lake was dark and enormous, and had been there long before any of them, and would be there long after. Hey, Alexander said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said, for coming back that night when you forgot the scarf. She looked at him for a moment. I didn't forget the scarf. I know. She looked at the city. Thank you for leaving it on the hook. He reached over and took her hand the way he had in the conservatory. Without ceremony, without announcement, as naturally as breathing. She held it. Inside in the room at the end of the hallway, Sophie was asleep with Bunn pressed against her chest, the repaired ear pointing slightly sideways, and she was not afraid of losing things tonight, because the house still contained everyone it was supposed to contain, and the list of things that were real and still here was longer now than it had ever been. There is a version of this story that turns on fate, on luck, on the extraordinary chain of coincidences that required a broken zipper and a delayed shift and a 3-year-old's attachment to a stuffed rabbit to set everything in motion. That version is true in its facts and misses the point entirely. The real version is about 2 people who were each, in their own way, practicing the art of survival, getting through, managing, reducing life to what was necessary, and who found, in the daily proximity of a shared kitchen and a small child and the honest conversation that comes from being tired together, that there was a version of life larger than survival, that the same instinct that makes a woman run toward a child in danger makes her, later and in quieter ways, run toward the things worth having. That love between adults is rarely the dramatic lightning strike of stories and mostly the accumulation of small decisions, to come back, to stay honest, to eat the terrible eggs without lying about their quality, to leave the scarf on the hook and see what happens. Sophie understood this in the way children understand things, not in words but in the body, in the architecture of her daily safety, in the reliable presence of people who showed up and kept showing up. She would grow up knowing, without being told explicitly, that families are made from choosing, not from blood and not from luck. but from the daily renewable decision to be present for each other. Claire Dawson, who had spent 30 years being the person who ran toward other people's emergencies, had finally stopped long enough to notice that someone was running toward hers. She didn't deserve it more than anyone else. She hadn't earned it through suffering. She just showed up when it mattered, and then kept showing up. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of all those ordinary days, something had been built that was bigger than any of the parts. She was not rescued. She was not transformed. She was finally known. And it turned out that was the thing she'd needed all along. Inside, Sophie called out from her room, not scared, not crying, just checking, doing the coordinates thing in the dark. "Daddy? Claire?" Alexander raised his eyebrows. Claire turned from the railing. They went inside together, leaving the city to manage itself, which it was fully capable of doing. "We're here, Bug," Claire said. "Okay," Sophie said, satisfied, and went back to sleep. The scarf was still on the hook by the door. Claire took it home the next morning.